I hired a plumber to fix a simple leak while my son and his wife were vacationing in Cancun. It was supposed to be a routine favor. I let the guy in, left him to do his job, and went about my day. But 2 hours later, my phone rang. It was Mike the plumber. His voice was shaking so hard I could barely understand him. He said, "You need to come back right now. There is a little boy hiding behind the water heater down here, and he will not come out." I drove back, thinking it was some neighborhood kid playing a prank. But what I uncovered in the freezing shadows of that basement was a secret so dark it nearly stopped my heart. If you are listening to this, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you will make you question the very souls of the people you call family. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets as I threw my truck into park outside Preston's massive suburban fortress. I sat there for a moment, the windshield wipers slapping back and forth, trying to make sense of Mike's frantic call. My name is Thomas Gallagher. I am 74 years old. I spent 40 long years building a property development empire from the ground up in Chicago. When my wife passed away a decade ago, my world fractured. But when my youngest daughter, Abigail, vanished without a trace 7 years ago, my world completely shattered. I handed the entire company over to my son, Preston, so I could focus every waking hour on finding her. Preston stepped up, or so I thought. He took the business, it married a woman named Valerie, and built this perfect life. They were currently sipping margaritas on a yacht in Cancun, leaving me to deal with a burst pipe. I pulled my collar up against the biting wind and stepped out into the storm. Mike was waiting for me on the covered porch. He is a big guy, a former Marine who has worked on my job sites for 15 years. I have seen Mike handle exploding pipes without blinking. But right now he looked terrified. He was pacing back and forth, his tool bag slung over his broad shoulder. His face was pale, his eyes darting toward the front door, as if something monstrous was waiting on the other side. "Mike, calm down," I said. "What is going on? Did a neighborhood kid break in through the window?" Mike shook his head, his hands visibly trembling, as he handed me the spare key. "Mr. Gallagher, I am so sorry. I am not going back down there. That is not a neighborhood kid playing hide and seek." I went down to the utility room to shut off the main valve. It was pitch black. The bulbs were unscrewed. I shined my flashlight behind the boiler, and I saw human eyes. "Sir, there is a child wedged in the crawl space. He is filthy. He looks like a ghost." I tried to coax him out, but he just screamed. It was like an animal that has been beaten too many times. "Preston does not have any children, Mike. Valerie cannot have kids. They do not even own a dog. You must be seeing things." "I know what I saw." Mike insisted, stepping off the porch. "I left the basement door open for you. I am sorry, Mr. Gallagher, but I have my own kids to think about. I do not want to be anywhere near whatever sick thing is happening in this house. You need to call the police." He jogged to his van, leaving me standing alone on the grand porch. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The instinct of a father, the gut feeling that something was horribly wrong, began to pulse through my veins. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. The house was immaculately clean, a stark contrast to the horror Mike had just described. Preston and Valerie's home belonged in a magazine. Vaulted ceilings, white marble floors, imported Italian leather furniture. The air smelled faintly of expensive vanilla candles. As I walked down the long hallway toward the basement door, my wet boots squeaked against the polished marble. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a runaway had managed to sneak in to escape the storm. But when I reached the top of the basement stairs, logical explanations evaporated. The air hitting my face was freezing, carrying a damp, metallic odor that did not belong in a luxury home. I flicked the light switch on the wall. Nothing happened. Mike was right. The bulbs had been disabled. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight, and began the slow descent down the wooden stairs. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed off the concrete walls, sounding weak and hollow. It is okay. I am not going to hurt you. I am the owner's father. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. I reached the bottom of the stairs. The utility room was tucked away in the far back corner of the sprawling basement, behind the home gym and the wine cellar. I walked slowly, my flashlight beam illuminating the expensive exercise equipment. Everything was perfectly normal until I reached the heavy steel door of the utility room. It was slightly ajar. I pushed the door open. The metallic smell was stronger here, mixed with the unmistakable scent of unwashed skin and fear. I swept my flashlight across the room. Copper pipes, the massive industrial water heater in the corner. I stepped closer to the heater, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Is anyone there?" I whispered. I moved the beam of light behind the dusty water heater. At first, I only saw the tangle of pipes and shadows. But then the light caught something. A small, trembling shoulder. A torn, oversized gray shirt. And then a pair of wide, terrified brown eyes staring back at me. Mike had not exaggerated. It was a little boy. He looked to be about 6 years old, but his frame was dangerously frail, his cheekbones jutting out from a dirt-smudged face. He was wedged into the tightest, darkest corner of the crawlspace, his knees pulled tightly to his chest. He was violently flinching, his whole body shaking, as if he expected me to strike him at any second. But it was not just his emaciated appearance that made the breath catch in my throat. It was what he was holding. Clutched tightly against his chest in his small, bruised hands was a small, rusted metal box. I recognized the intricate floral engravings instantly, even under the layer of grime. It was a custom-made music box. The exact same music box I had specially ordered and given to my daughter Abigail on her 10th birthday. The music box she had taken with her the night she vanished 7 years ago. My knees buckled. I dropped to the cold concrete floor, my flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The world began to spin. How did this boy get into my son's locked basement? Why was he hiding like a beaten dog? And how, by the grace of God, did he have my missing daughter's music box? I tried to speak, to ask him his name, to ask him where he got it. But the boy just pressed himself harder against the cold concrete wall, his eyes wide with a terror that no child should ever know. I realized then that I could not wait. I could not hesitate. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands, dialing Preston's number in Cancun. The phone rang, echoing loudly in the silent, freezing basement. "Come on, pick up," I muttered, my heart racing. "Pick up the phone, Preston." The line connected on the third ring. The loud, vibrant sound of a mariachi band and crashing ocean waves blasted through the speaker, a grotesque contrast to the nightmare I was staring at. "Hey, Dad." Preston's voice was cheerful, relaxed, slightly slurred from alcohol. "Did the plumber get everything sorted out? We are just about to head out on the catamaran." I stared at the starving boy, holding my lost daughter's music box, and a cold, terrifying realization washed over me. I was not speaking to a successful businessman. I was not speaking to a loving son. I was speaking to a monster. And I was going to tear his perfect life apart to find out the truth. I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The lively mariachi music in the background felt like a sick joke compared to the freezing dampness of the basement. I forced my voice to remain calm, masking the rising tide of panic. "Preston," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the shivering child. "There is a little boy locked in your utility room. He is hiding behind the water heater. He looks terrified. Why is there a child down here?" There was a brief pause on the line. The music faded slightly as Preston shifted the phone far away. "Dad, calm down," Preston replied. His tone was incredibly smooth, dripping with the practiced patience of a successful salesman. "I can explain everything. That is Toby. He is the distant nephew of Valerie." I let out a slow breath, trying to process his words. "You never told me Valerie had a nephew," I said. Preston chuckled, a light, dismissive sound that made my stomach turn. We did not want to bother you with it, Dad. You have been stressed lately with your search for Abigail. We just wanted to spare you the extra burden of dealing with our personal drama. Preston continued his explanation without missing a beat. Toby has severe nonverbal autism, he said softly, feigning deep concern. He suffers from violent outbursts. Sometimes he gets incredibly overwhelmed and hides in dark places to calm down. The basement is his safe space. We hired an elite specialized nanny to watch him while we are away. We are paying her $300 a day. She must have just stepped out to the pharmacy to grab his medications. I stared at the boy. He did not look like he was in a safe space. He looked completely hunted now. Then the voice of Valerie chimed in through the speakerphone. Her tone was dripping with absolute sweetness. "Oh, Thomas, I am so sorry you had to find him like that," she cooed. "We took Toby in because his parents could not handle his condition. It has been exhausting, but we are doing our best. He is terrified of strangers, Thomas. Please do not try to touch him or pull him out. He might bite or hurt himself. Just let the plumber finish his work and lock the door when you leave. The nanny will return very soon to feed him." I looked at the heavy steel door behind me. I remembered the heavy-duty deadbolts installed on the outside. You do not lock a child in a room from the outside for his own comfort. But I knew I had to play along. If I tipped them off, they might panic and send someone to remove the boy. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. "I understand," I said evenly. "I will leave him be. The plumber is already done. I am going to head home right now. Enjoy the rest of your trip down there." I hung up. The silence returned heavier than before. I turned my flashlight back to the corner. The boy had not moved an inch. His small hands were still clutching the rusty music box against his chest. I slowly lowered myself to the ground, sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete. I was not going anywhere. If they had a nanny, I was going to meet her. And if they did not, I was going to find out exactly what was happening in this house. I turned off my flashlight to save battery, plunging the room into deep, suffocating darkness once again. I sat there in the pitch black for 3 agonizing hours. The damp cold seeped through my jacket, chilling me to the bone. During that entire time, the heavy front door upstairs never opened. No footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. No highly paid nanny arrived to check on her vulnerable charge. The lie was unraveling before my eyes. My son and his wife had left this fragile child alone, locked in a freezing room, while they drank cocktails on a tropical beach. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, my mind racing through horrifying possibilities and terrible thoughts. Eventually, I heard a faint, raspy sound from the corner. It was a weak, trembling cough. I turned on my flashlight, aiming the beam at the floor near the water heater so I would not blind him. The boy was shivering violently, his thin shoulders shaking under his torn shirt. I reached into my coat pocket. I always carried a small pack of peanut butter crackers with me to keep my blood sugar stable. I slowly pulled the package out, rustling loudly in the quiet room. The boy flinched, pulling his knees tighter to his chest in fear. I tore the plastic open and slid a single cracker across the dusty floor. It stopped just a few inches from his bare feet. "Look," I whispered, keeping my voice as soft as possible. "It is food. You can have it." For a long moment, he did not move. He just stared at the cracker with wide, desperate eyes. Then, with terrifying speed, his small hand shot out. He snatched the cracker and shoved it into his mouth. He did not eat like a child with sensory issues. He ate like an animal that had been utterly starved for days. He devoured the first cracker in seconds and looked back at me, his eyes pleading for more. I slid another cracker across the floor, then another. He ate them all with the same frantic hunger. As he reached for the 4th cracker, his small hands trembled. The rusty music box slipped from his grasp. It clattered onto the concrete floor. The sudden impact knocked the old latch open. A delicate, tinkling melody immediately filled the cold basement. It was a beautiful, haunting tune that cut through the silence. My heart completely stopped. I recognized that familiar song almost instantly now. It was a custom melody, a rare European waltz. I had ordered that exact music box from an antique dealer in Paris 2 decades ago. I gave it to my youngest daughter, Abigail, for her 10th birthday. She loved it more than anything in the world. When she ran away from home 7 years ago, she left almost everything behind in her bedroom. But she took that music box. I stared at the rusted metal, watching the tiny gears spin in the flashlight beam. My mind struggled to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding right in front of my own eyes. How did a boy hidden in the basement of my son possess the one item my missing daughter cherished most? I slowly crawled forward, closing the distance between us. The boy shrank back against the pipes, whimpering softly. I held my hands up, showing him I meant no harm. I carefully picked up the music box. The intricate floral engravings were covered in grime, but the initials engraved on the bottom were still clearly visible. A G, Abigail Gallagher. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. This child was not a distant autistic nephew of Valerie. I held the phone tighter against my ear, listening to the cheerful mariachi music blaring in the background. Preston was waiting for my response, his tone totally relaxed, completely unbothered by the starving child nearby. I needed to play this carefully. I could not let him know my terrifying discovery. I could not reveal that I had seen the rusted music box clutched in the boy's hands, or that I already realized the horrifying depth of his dark deception. I had to maintain the illusion. I had to be the clueless, helpful father he expected me to be right now. Preston, I said, forcing my voice to sound tired and confused instead of furious. There is a little boy down here in the utility room. He is hiding behind the water heater. He looks completely terrified. What is going on? The music in the background muffled slightly as Preston listened. He covered the receiver, likely stepping away from the loud party. When he spoke again, his voice was lowered into a smooth, practiced tone of mild annoyance. Dad. Please calm down, he said, exhaling a long sigh, as if I were a nagging child, interrupting his well-deserved sunny vacation. That is Toby. He is a distant nephew of Valerie. We did not want to bother you with the details because you have been so stressed with your own issues lately. Toby has severe autism. He is completely nonverbal and gets violently overwhelmed by strangers. He likes the total dark. It is his safe space. We hired an elite nanny to watch him, a professional who charges $300 a day. She probably just ran out to the pharmacy to get his specialty medications. Just leave him alone, lock the basement door, and go home right now. Do not touch him, Dad. He will bite you. I closed my eyes, absorbing the chilling perfection of his lie. It was so plausible, so smoothly delivered. If I had not seen my missing daughter's music box in the boy's hands, I might have actually believed him without a second doubtful thought. I looked at the heavy steel door of the utility room. I thought about the heavy-duty deadbolts I had noticed earlier, the ones installed on the outside of the door. You do not lock an autistic child inside a freezing, windowless room for his own comfort. You lock up to door from the outside when you are keeping a prisoner. I understand, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. The plumber already packed up his tools and left anyway. The guy was completely spooked by the dark. I will lock up and head out. Enjoy the rest of your trip. Thanks, Dad. Seriously, just lock the door and leave. The nanny will be back any minute. He ended the call, and the line went dead. I lowered the phone, the silence of the basement crashing back over me like a tidal wave. I stood alone in the utility room, devastated. The grim reality of the situation was pressing down on my chest. Earlier, Mike the plumber had practically run to his van, thoroughly spooked by what he had seen. He had packed his tools and fled, refusing to be part of whatever nightmare was unfolding in this large house today. I did not blame him. But I was not a hired contractor. I was a father, and right now I was standing face to face with a ghost. I slowly swept my flashlight around the room, taking in the full horror of the environment. The stark contrast was truly staggering. Preston's pristine house upstairs was vastly different from this dark, freezing corner of the basement. Upstairs, the home was a $2 million fortress of luxury. There were vaulted ceilings, white marble floors, imported Italian leather sofas, and a custom kitchen filled with appliances that cost more than most earn. Preston and Valerie lived like royalty, projecting an image of absolute perfection to the world. But down here, hidden beneath their feet, was a dungeon. There were no windows, no heating vents, no soft carpets. The concrete floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and awful grimy filth. The air was so cold I could see my own breath fogging in the beam of my flashlight. In the far corner, pushed against the damp cinder block wall, was a stained, torn mattress pad. Beside it sat a cheap plastic bucket and a gravity-fed food dispenser for a dog. It was the kind you would buy at a pet store to feed an animal while you were out of town. It was barbaric. They were treating this child worse than a dog. I turned my attention back to the boy. He was still wedged tightly behind the large heater. His knees were pulled up to his chin. He was shivering violently, his thin, bruised arms wrapped protectively around the rusted music box. I needed to get him out of that corner, but I remembered Preston's warning. The child was terrified of strangers. I had to move very slowly today. "Hey there, buddy," I whispered, keeping my voice as gentle and steady as I could. I crouched down, placing my flashlight on the floor, so the beam illuminated the room without shining directly into his sensitive eyes. "I am not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas. Hello there. What is your name?" The boy did not speak. He just violently flinched, pressing himself harder against the cold metal of the water heater, as if he expected me to strike him. His eyes darted around the room, wild and desperate. The absolute terror in his gaze shattered my heart. I had raised 2 children. I knew what a normal, healthy child looked like. This boy had been conditioned by fear. He had been taught that adults only brought pain and punishment. "It is okay," I said softly, staying exactly where I was. "I am a friend to you now. I am just here to help you get warm. It is very cold down here." I slowly reached into my coat pocket. I always carried a few snacks in my jacket for when I was working long hours on construction sites. I pulled out a small package of peanut crackers. The plastic wrapper crinkled loudly in the suffocating silence of the basement. The boy gasped, his small body tensing up instantly. I did not move closer. I simply placed the package of crackers on the concrete floor and slid it gently toward him. It stopped near his bare, dirty feet. "You can have that," I whispered. "I bet you are very hungry." For a long minute, he did not move. He just stared at the bright orange packaging, his chest heaving with shallow, rapid breaths. His gaze flicked from the crackers up to my face, searching for a hidden trap. When I remained perfectly still, his survival instinct finally overrode his fear. His small, trembling hand shot out from behind his knees. He snatched the package with lightning speed and ripped it open with his teeth. He did not eat like a normal child, enjoying a simple, tasty afternoon snack. "How was my grandson?" The boy staring back at me with those wide, terrified brown eyes was the child of my missing daughter. My mind reeled as a sickening wave of horror washed over me. Abigail had vanished 7 years ago. We had spent millions on private investigators, searched across state lines, and followed every dead-end lead. All this time, Preston claimed he was helping me look for her. All this time, he had been locking her child in his freezing basement. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the concrete walls down with my bare hands. But I could not afford to lose control. Not right now. Toby was shaking, pressing himself against the pipes, watching me cry. I wiped the tears from my face and forced a gentle, reassuring smile. I slowly pushed the music box back toward him. He grabbed it immediately, pulling it tight against his thin chest. "It is okay, Toby," I whispered. "You are safe now. I am going to get you out of this dark place." I stood up, my joints aching. Just as I turned toward the heavy steel door, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. The sudden noise made Toby gasp and cover his ears. I pulled the phone out and looked at the bright screen. It was an incoming video call from Valerie. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were checking up on me. They wanted to make sure I had actually left their precious house. I took a deep breath, smoothing my expression into a mask of mild annoyance. I stepped out of the utility room, pulled the heavy steel door shut behind me, and slid the deadbolt into place with a loud metallic clack. I answered the call. Valerie appeared on the screen, her blonde hair blowing in the tropical breeze, wearing designer sunglasses and holding a bright pink cocktail. "Thomas," she chirped, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I am so sorry to bother you again. Preston said you were just leaving. Is everything all right down there?" I forced a tired chuckle. "Everything is fine, Valerie," I replied, holding the phone up so the camera captured the locked steel door behind me. "I just locked the utility room like Preston asked. The plumber is gone and I am heading up the stairs right now. I hope your nephew settles down soon. It breaks my heart to see a child so frightened." Valerie sighed, a perfect performance of an exhausted caregiver. "It is so difficult, Thomas. We just try to give him the best life possible. Thank you so much for handling the leak. We owe you a nice dinner when we get back." I smiled into the camera. "Enjoy the beach, Valerie. I will see you both next week." I ended the call and my smile vanished instantly. My blood ran completely cold. I looked up at the ceiling of the finished basement. There was a small blinking blue light in the corner. A smart security camera. They were watching the house. If I walked out the front door carrying Toby, they would see it on their phones in Cancun. They would call the local police and report me for kidnapping. I needed to blind them. I quickly scanned the walls and found the main utility panel. Next to it sat the high-speed internet router that powered the entire smart home system. I did not just unplug it. I grabbed my flashlight, smashed the plastic casing, and ripped the power supply wires straight out of the wall. The blinking blue light died. If they checked their app, it would just look like a local power surge had knocked out the internet connection. I had bought myself a small window of time. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt on the utility room door and stepped back inside. Toby was exactly where I left him. I took off my winter coat and approached him slowly. "I am going to wrap you up so you stay warm," I whispered. I knelt down and draped the thick wool coat over his fragile shoulders. He flinched, but the warmth of the fabric seemed to calm him slightly. I scooped him up into my arms. He weighed almost nothing. A 6-year-old boy should not feel this light. He buried his dirty face into my shoulder, his small hands still clutching the music box tight against my chest. I carried him up the wooden stairs, avoiding the main living areas entirely. I moved through the mudroom and into the attached garage. There were no cameras in here. I opened the side access door, slipping out into the pouring rain. I ran to my truck, opened the passenger door, and placed Toby gently onto the heated leather seat. I buckled the seatbelt around him and locked the doors. I got behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove away from my son's house as fast as the storm would allow. I could not go to the police yet. If I reported this right now, Child Protective Services would take Toby into custody. They would alert Preston and Valerie immediately. Those two monsters would hire expensive defense lawyers and spin a web of lies. I needed absolute proof of what they had done. I needed to know exactly what happened to my daughter Abigail. I drove to the private clinic of Dr. Eris. He was an old, trusted family pediatrician who had treated both Preston and Abigail when they were children. I called him from the road and begged him to open his back door for an emergency. When I carried Toby into the brightly lit examination room, Dr. Eris gasped. "Thomas, what in the world happened to this child?" he asked, rushing over with a soft, warm blanket. I set Toby carefully on the examination table. "I found him locked in the basement of Preston," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Preston claims he is an autistic nephew, but doctor, I know in my bones that this is my grandson. This is the boy of Abigail. Dr. Aris looked at me with wide eyes, then turned his professional focus entirely to Toby. The boy shrank away from the bright lights, whimpering softly. Dr. Aris moved with gentleness, checking his vitals and fragile frame. I stood by the door watching as the horrible truth of the existence of Toby was laid bare. Dr. Aris gently lifted the torn shirt, revealing a torso covered in dark, terrible bruises. "These are defensive wounds," Thomas the doctor whispered, his voice thick with horror. "Someone has been hitting him." Dr. Aris drew a small vial of blood for testing. He looked at me with a grim, devastated expression. "Thomas, this boy is severely malnourished," the doctor said quietly, "and his heart rate is unnaturally slow. I suspect they have been dosing him with heavy sedatives, maybe even animal tranquilizers, just to keep him completely quiet." I felt the floor drop out from under me. My own son was torturing this innocent boy. I looked at Dr. Aris and made my decision. "I need a rapid DNA test right now," I said. Dr. Aris blinked, clearly taken aback by the sudden demand. He looked from my furious face down to the frail, trembling boy sitting on the examination table. "Thomas, a DNA test is not a simple request to make off the books," he said slowly, keeping his voice low so as not to frighten the child further. "I can draw the blood and send it to an independent lab under a pseudonym, but we are crossing a very dangerous legal line here. If this boy is being abused, my medical license and the law dictate that I must call Child Protective Services immediately. We cannot just hide him here." I stepped closer to the doctor. I placed my hands on his shoulders, looking directly into his tired, kind eyes. "You cannot call them yet," I pleaded, my voice cracking with a desperate intensity. "Please listen to me. If you involve the state right now, the system will automatically notify his registered guardians. That means Preston and Valerie will get a phone call in Cancun within the hour. If they find out I took this boy, they will spin a web of lies so thick we will never cut through it. They will claim I am a senile, grieving old man who kidnapped their autistic nephew. They will have him back in that freezing basement before the sun sets tomorrow, and I will be sitting in a jail cell." Dr. Aris sighed, running a hand over his face. He looked at Toby, who had pulled his knees back to his chest and was quietly humming the tune from the rusty music box. "What makes you think this is Abigail's child?" Thomas the doctor asked softly. "It has been 7 years. She vanished without a trace." I held the rusted metal box out for the doctor to see. Toby was clutching this when I found him hiding behind the water heater. I explained, my throat tightening with raw emotion. "I custom-ordered this music box from Paris for Abigail on her 10th birthday. There is absolutely no way a random nephew of Valerie would have this specific item. He is my grandson. I know it in my bones. But I need absolute scientific proof before I tear my son's life apart. I have to know the complete truth." Dr. Aris stared at the music box, recognizing the profound weight of my discovery. He nodded slowly, his expression hardening with grim determination. "Okay, Thomas," he said firmly. "I will run the tests. I will keep him safe here in the clinic overnight. My wife and I can watch him. But you have to tell me what the ultimate goal is. Why would Preston hide his own nephew?" "Money." I replied, the word tasting like poison in my mouth. "It always comes down to money." I explained the intricate details of our family trust fund, a massive financial portfolio worth $15 million. The terms of the trust were ironclad. If Abigail remained missing and was declared legally dead without an heir, the entire $15 million would automatically default to my only remaining child, Preston. However, if Abigail had a living heir, that child would inherit every single penny of her share. "Preston and Valerie have been living vastly beyond their means," I said, my anger flaring hot. "I suspect they have been waiting out the 7-year legal clock. Next Friday marks exactly 7 years since Abigail disappeared. Under Illinois law, she can be declared dead in absentia on that very day." The doctor's face went completely pale as the horrifying reality of the situation set in. If the state knew this boy existed, Preston would lose millions, he whispered in shock. I nodded. Exactly. They hid him to secure the money. Dr. Aris did not waste another second. He immediately went to his medical cabinets and began preparing the necessary equipment. He drew a vial of blood from Toby, who barely flinched at the needle. The child was so accustomed to pain that a small prick did not even register as a threat. It was a heartbreaking sight. I pulled my wallet out and carefully extracted a small, folded piece of wax paper. Inside was a single strand of blonde hair perfectly preserved. It belonged to Abigail. I had pulled it from her hairbrush the week she ran away and kept it with me every single day since hoping it might one day help a private investigator find her. I handed it to the doctor. I will send this to a private facility across town, Dr. Aris said, sealing the samples securely. We will have the results in 48 hours. While we wait, I need to run a full comprehensive blood panel on Toby right now. I need to know exactly what they have been putting into his fragile system. I will run it through my in-house machine. It should only take about an hour. I thanked him and sat down in the plastic chair in the corner of the examination room. Toby had drifted into a restless, exhausted sleep on the examination table, wrapped tightly in the warm blankets the doctor had provided. I watched his small chest rise and fall, tracking the dark, ugly bruises that marred his pale skin. Every mark on his body fueled the burning, righteous fury building inside my soul. The hours stretched on with agonizing slowness. The quiet hum of the clinic's machinery was the only sound in the sterile room. I spent the time mentally preparing for the war that was coming. I was no longer just a retired developer. I was a father seeking justice for his missing daughter and a grandfather protecting a battered child. Finally, the heavy wooden door to the examination room opened. Dr. Aris walked in, holding a stack of printed medical papers. He did not look at me at first. He walked over to the sleeping boy, gently adjusting the blanket around his small shoulders. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was completely shattered. The grim news was written all over his tired features. Thomas the doctor began, his voice trembling with a mixture of professional shock and deep personal disgust. I have seen many terrible things in my 40 years of practicing medicine, but this is beyond comprehension. The blood panel results just finished processing. I stood up, my muscles tense. Tell me, I demanded softly. Toby is suffering from severe prolonged malnutrition, the doctor explained, looking down at the papers. His vitamin levels are dangerously low and his bone density is severely compromised for a child of his age. They have been feeding him just enough to keep his organs from shutting down completely. But that is not the worst part, Thomas. I braced myself, my hands balling into tight fists at my sides. What is it? I asked. The doctor took a shaky breath. The blood test confirms my worst suspicions. Toby has high concentrations of xylazine in his bloodstream. It is an animal tranquilizer. They drugged him. They have been poisoning this boy to keep him quiet inside that basement. The words hung in the sterile air of the examination room. I stared at the doctor, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the cruelty he had just described. Animal tranquilizers. My own son, the boy I had raised, the man I had trusted with my entire business empire, was actively poisoning a helpless 6-year-old child. He was treating him worse than livestock. The rage that erupted inside my chest was blinding. It was not a hot, reckless anger. It was a cold, absolute fury that sharpened every single one of my senses to a razor edge. I looked past the doctor and focused my gaze on Toby. The boy was still sleeping, his small chest rising and falling in a shallow, unnatural rhythm dictated by the toxic chemicals coursing through his fragile veins. The rusted music box was still resting on the table right next to his small hand. I walked over and gently picked it up. The intricate floral patterns were heavily tarnished, but they still caught the harsh fluorescent light of the clinic. I ran my thumb over the engraved initials on the bottom. Abigail Gallagher. A horrifying realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The music box. the specific shade of his wide brown eyes, the timing of his apparent age. I turned back to Dr. Aris, my voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "This is not just a kidnapping," I said, my hands gripping the metal box so tightly my joints ached. "This is a calculated long-term operation." I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. My fingers were completely steady as I opened it and carefully extracted a small folded piece of wax paper from the hidden back compartment. I had carried this small packet with me every single day for the past 7 years. I opened it and held it out to the doctor. Inside rested a single perfectly preserved strand of blonde hair. I pulled this from the hairbrush of Abigail. The morning after she vanished, I explained the memory of that terrible day flashing behind my eyes. I kept it hoping that one day a private investigator might need it for a forensic match. I never imagined I would be using it like this. Dr. Aris took the wax paper with the utmost care, his professional demeanor returning as he realized the gravity of my request. "I need you to rush a DNA test," I demanded. "I need you to compare a genetic swab from Toby against this sample from my missing daughter. You must do it completely off the books. No official state records. No automated alerts to Child Protective Services. Just a private, expedited laboratory match." The doctor nodded slowly, walking over to his medical supply cabinet. He pulled out a sterile buccal swab and carefully gathered a saliva sample from the inside of the sleeping cheek of Toby. He placed the swab into a secure plastic vial and sealed the strand of hair into a separate evidence container. "I have a colleague at a private genetics facility across the city," the doctor murmured, labeling the vials with a blank marker. "He owes me a significant favor. I can have him run the comparison panel immediately. But Thomas, you have to tell me what is truly at stake here. Why would Preston go to such extreme, horrific lengths to hide this specific child in a dark basement?" I sat back down heavily in the plastic chair, feeling the crushing weight of my immense wealth. "It is about the family trust fund," I said quietly. "Decades ago, when my property development business first became highly successful, I established a $15 million trust for my 2 children. It was meant to secure their futures and protect our family legacy." I leaned forward, making sure the doctor understood every single word. "The legal terms of that specific trust are absolutely ironclad," I continued. "The money is locked in a high-yield account that cannot be fully accessed until certain conditions are met. If Abigail remains missing and is declared legally dead without leaving behind any heir, her entire half of the fortune automatically defaults directly to her brother. Preston gets everything, all $15 million. The doctor stopped moving. He stared at me, the vials resting silently in his hands. "But what happens if Abigail has a child?" the doctor asked, his voice barely more than a breath. I looked at Toby. "If Abigail has a living heir, that child automatically inherits her entire share," I replied. "Preston would lose half of the fortune instantly. The state of Illinois has very strict laws regarding missing persons. Next Friday marks exactly 7 years to the day since Abigail vanished. Under the law, a person who has been missing for 7 years can be officially declared dead in absentia by a judge. Preston and Valerie have been living vastly beyond their means for the past 2 years. They bought that $2 million house, they drive imported luxury cars, and they take lavish vacations to places like Cancun. They are completely drowning in debt, waiting for the legal clock to run out, so they can claim the full $15 million. I pointed at the sleeping boy. But if Toby is the biological son of Abigail, their entire financial plan collapses. They hid him in that freezing basement to secure the money. They drugged him to keep him quiet, because they knew that if I ever found out he existed, I would protect him, and they would lose their massive payout." Dr. Aris shook his head in absolute disgust. He placed the sealed vials into a specialized transport bag. "It is pure evil, Thomas. It is a level of greed that I cannot even begin to comprehend. I will drive these samples to the private laboratory myself tonight. But you need to prepare yourself for a wait. An expedited off-the-books DNA panel will still take at least 48 hours to process fully. We will not have the definitive results until Thursday morning. I nodded, absorbing the timeline. 48 hours felt like an eternity, but it also gave me a crucial window of opportunity. I needed to move fast before Preston and Valerie returned from their tropical vacation. I stood up, buttoning my thick winter coat tightly against the chill. I cannot take Toby with me, I said firmly, glancing back at the sleeping child. My house is the first place they will search when they discover he is gone. Dr. Aris nodded slowly. He will stay safely hidden right here, Thomas. My wife is a retired pediatric nurse. We will keep him warm and closely monitor his vitals until those terrible toxins completely leave his system. No one will know he is here. I thanked my old friend and walked out into the relentless storm. I did not drive toward my own home. I turned my heavy truck back toward Preston's dark house. I reached behind my seat, grabbing a solid steel crowbar. I gripped the cold metal tightly, marching toward the front door. The storm was raging with a renewed violent intensity as I approached the massive oak door of my son's house. The icy rain battered my face, but I did not feel the freezing cold. I only felt the burning need for the truth driving my every single step. I completely bypassed the heavily guarded main entrance. Preston had a state-of-the-art security system installed there, and breaking the glass would trigger an immediate armed police response. Instead, I moved quietly around the side of the expansive property, slipping through the dark shadows until I reached the secluded patio door that led directly into his private study. Preston always boasted about his exclusive home office, a room he kept strictly off-limits to everyone, including his own wife. He claimed it contained highly sensitive corporate documents that required absolute uncompromising security. I raised the solid steel crowbar. I wedged the curved edge deep into the narrow seam of the heavy French doors. With a sharp, forceful heave, I threw all of my physical weight backward. The reinforced locking mechanism groaned, protesting under the immense pressure, before finally snapping with a loud, satisfying crack. The wooden frame splintered and the door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a heavy thud. I stepped inside the dark room, pulling my flashlight from my wet coat pocket. The narrow beam of light swept slowly across the inner sanctum of Preston. It was a space designed to project absolute power and unyielding wealth. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the dark painted walls, filled with pristine leather-bound volumes that looked like they had never been opened or read. A massive Persian rug covered the polished hardwood floor, and a sprawling mahogany desk sat dead center, dominating the entire room. It looked exactly like the office of a brilliant, unstoppable titan of industry. But I knew better now. The flawless, intimidating aesthetic was nothing more than a carefully constructed theatrical stage. I did not care about preserving his pristine environment anymore. I grabbed the edge of the nearest bookshelf and forcefully swept my arm across the middle shelf. Dozens of heavy books tumbled to the floor, crashing loudly into the suffocating silence of the empty house. I moved directly to the tall metal filing cabinets tucked away in the corner, using the sharp end of the crowbar to pry the locked drawers open. Metal screeched as the steel buckled and gave way. I began pulling out thick manila folders, tossing them carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug. I dropped to my knees, shining my flashlight over the scattered papers, searching frantically for anything that could explain why my grandson was locked in a freezing basement. I sifted through endless piles of mundane utility bills, property tax receipts, and expensive home insurance policies. But as I dug much deeper into a thick stack of folders hidden at the very back of the bottom drawer, the grand narrative of my son's supposedly successful life began to rapidly unravel. I opened a heavy red folder labeled with the name of his primary property development company. This was the exact company I had handed over to him when I retired to search for my missing daughter. I pulled out the top document. It was a finalized legal notice from a federal bankruptcy court. I blinked, bringing the flashlight closer to the crisp white page to ensure I was reading it correctly. The devastating document was dated exactly 2 years ago. I quickly opened the other related folders in the massive stack. Every single business entity Preston managed, every subsidiary he claimed was thriving and expanding. Across the state had officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The multi-million-dollar development projects he constantly bragged about during our family holiday dinners were complete utter fabrications. The massive commercial contracts he claimed to have secured simply did not exist anywhere outside of his own lies. My son was a total, absolute fraud. He had driven my entire life's work completely into the ground. He had lost everything I built quietly, liquidating the remaining assets just to keep up his wealthy appearances. The imported luxury cars, the designer clothes, the $2 million home. None of it was paid for by legitimate corporate profits. He was completely broke, drowning in a relentless sea of insurmountable, crushing debt. I sat back on my heels, the grim bankruptcy papers resting heavily in my lap. If his companies had been dead and buried for 2 full years, how was he paying the $7,000 monthly mortgage on this massive suburban house? How was he affording luxury tropical vacations to Cancun while simultaneously maintaining a perfectly wealthy facade? The math did not add up at all. There had to be another hidden source of income, something entirely off the official books. I stood up, my knees popping, and walked purposefully over to the massive mahogany desk. I yanked the heavy side drawers open, throwing expensive silver pens and custom stationery to the floor. I pulled the wide center drawer out, completely dumping its contents onto the Persian rug. As I did, I noticed something distinctly odd about the heavy wooden construction. The interior depth of the center drawer did not match the exterior dimensions of the wooden panel. The inside was far too shallow, leaving at least 2 inches of unaccounted space. I set my flashlight down on the polished wood surface and ran my bare fingertips along the inside edges of the empty drawer. I felt a tiny concealed metal latch hidden discreetly underneath the back lip. I pressed it firmly with my thumb. The bottom panel of the drawer clicked softly and popped slightly upward. I carefully lifted the thin wooden board away, revealing a secret hidden compartment underneath. Inside the shallow space rested a single thick black binder. I lifted it out, my hands trembling slightly, and flipped it open under the harsh beam of my flashlight. Inside were dozens of official state bank statements from a completely separate secret checking account. I scanned the most recent deposit logs, my eyes widening in absolute horror as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Preston was receiving massive regular deposits from the state government every single month. The deposits were clearly labeled as a high-level special needs foster care stipend. The account was registered under a completely fake identity created specifically for Toby, claiming he required round-the-clock specialized medical care. My own son had not just locked my helpless grandson in a freezing basement. He was using the beaten, starving child as a captive source of income. The documents showed he was collecting $8,000 a month. Every penny was being transferred to pay for his sports cars and designer clothing. He had turned his own nephew into a silent, invisible paycheck. The cruelty was so profound that it took my breath away entirely. I stared down at the damning papers, the hard proof of his unimaginable betrayal clutched tightly in my shaking hands. This was no longer just a rescue mission. This was going to be the absolute, undeniable destruction of his entire fake world. I folded the bank statements carefully and tucked them inside my coat pocket. The sheer magnitude of this betrayal was staggering, but I could not allow my shock to paralyze me. I needed to move fast and strike hard. Preston and Valerie had built an elaborate, sickening fortress of lies, and I needed someone who knew exactly how to tear that kind of fortress down to its foundation. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my usual corporate attorneys and scrolled down to a number I had only used a handful of times in my career. It was the direct line to Victor Russo. Victor was a private investigator who operated strictly in the gray areas of the law. He was ruthless, incredibly efficient, and terrifyingly thorough. He did not care about family sensitivities or polite boundaries. If there was a secret buried anywhere in the world, Victor could dig it up in a matter of hours. I dialed his number and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring loudly in the silent, ransacked office. Victor answered on the second ring. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like crushed stone. "Thomas," he said simply, skipping any polite greetings. "It is late. What do you need?" I kept my voice just as cold and direct as his. "I need you to run a full, deep background check on my daughter-in-law, Valerie," I replied. "I want her entire family tree mapped out from the roots to the highest branches. I need medical records, birth certificates, and financial ties. But most importantly, Victor, I need you to find out if she has any siblings or extended family members who recently placed a 6-year-old autistic boy into her care. I need to know if she has a nephew." I heard the faint clicking of a computer keyboard on his end of the line. "Consider it done, Thomas," Victor replied smoothly. "How deep do you want me to dig if I start hitting locked state files or sealed family court records?" I did not hesitate for a single second. "Break the locks," I commanded, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I do not care what it costs or who you have to bribe to get the information. I want every single dirty secret she has ever tried to hide. You will have a preliminary report before sunrise," Victor promised, and then the line went completely dead. I lowered the phone and took a long, shaky breath. The storm outside continued to rage, heavy rain lashing against the shattered French doors I had broken to enter the study. I turned my flashlight back to the massive mahogany desk. The false bottom drawer was still completely exposed. I had already removed the binder filled with the fraudulent foster care bank statements, but my instincts told me to look closer. The hidden compartment was deep enough to hold more than just a single binder. I reached my hand back into the dark, narrow space, feeling along the very back edge where the shadows pooled thickly. My fingertips brushed against something cold and smooth. It felt like soft, expensive leather. I gripped the object and pulled it out into the harsh beam of the flashlight. It was a small, black, leather-bound calendar planner. The cover was completely blank, but the pages inside were heavily dog-eared and marked with various colored sticky notes. I opened the planner, carefully flipping through the pages. The handwriting was sharp, jagged, and unmistakably belonged to Valerie. I recognized her precise, meticulous script from the dozens of passive-aggressive holiday cards she had sent me over the years. The planner was not a normal schedule of social events or business meetings. It was a detailed, highly calculated financial timeline. I saw dates marked for transferring funds between offshore accounts, reminders to renew the fake medical prescriptions for Toby, and notes about rotating cash withdrawals to avoid federal banking alerts. They were running a highly sophisticated, deeply illegal operation right under my nose. I continued to turn the pages, my dread growing with every single line I read. I flipped to the current month of October. My eyes scanned down the rows of neat black ink until they stopped dead on the final week of the month. Next Friday was circled thickly in bright, aggressive red marker. I brought the flashlight closer, my breath catching in my throat. The red circle was drawn on so forcefully that the ink had bled right through the heavy paper. Written in the absolute center of the circle, underlined 3 times, were 4 words that made my blood run completely cold. Abigail, 7 years. Payday. I stared at the terrifying ink, the realization hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. Next Friday marked exactly 7 years since my beautiful daughter Abigail had vanished into the night. Under the strict laws of the state of Illinois, a missing person could be officially legally declared dead in absentia after exactly 7 years of absolute absence. Once a judge signed that declaration, the $15 million family trust fund I had established would instantly activate. If Abigail was dead and had no living heir, her entire fortune would immediately default directly to Preston. That was the payday Valerie had circled. That was the finish line they had been racing toward. They had locked Toby in the freezing basement and drugged him with animal tranquilizers to erase his very existence. If the state or the family trust lawyers knew that Abigail had a living, breathing son, Toby would inherit every single penny of the massive fortune. Preston and Valerie would get absolutely nothing. They were holding my grandson captive to steal his inheritance. I traced my trembling finger over the bright red circle on the calendar page. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their plan was suffocating. They were not just greedy. They were monsters who were perfectly willing to torture an innocent, helpless child just to fund their empty, luxurious lifestyle. I carefully closed the leather-bound planner and placed it inside my coat pocket, right next to the fraudulent bank statements. I now held the physical keys to their complete, absolute destruction. All I needed now was the final confirmation from Victor Russo to lock the heavy doors of their prison cell. I walked over to a dark leather armchair in the corner and sat down to wait in silence. The silence in the house was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the falling rain. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. I watched the digital clock on my phone screen glow in the darkness. Finally, precisely at 3 in the morning, the harsh vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet tension of the room. It was Victor Russo. I answered the call immediately, pressing the cold glass to my ear. Tom, Victor said, his gravelly voice sounding even more serious than before. I checked the family tree of Valerie very thoroughly, Thomas. She is an only child. Her parents are dead. There is absolutely no nephew. The line went dead. I stood in the dark, ransacked office of my son, listening to the rain battering the shattered doors. Victor had just confirmed the undeniable truth. There was no nephew. The starving boy locked in the freezing basement was not some relative placed in the charitable care of Valerie. He was my blood. He was the child of my missing daughter, Abigail. My grandson had been living right under my nose, hidden away like a dirty secret, while Preston and Valerie drained state funds to finance their empty lifestyle. The magnitude of their deception was suffocating. I tucked the phone into my pocket. I had the bank statements. I had the planner with the terrifying red circle drawn around next Friday. But I knew a seasoned defense attorney could spin circumstantial evidence. I needed absolute proof of their endgame. I swept the flashlight beam across the dark walls. My eyes settled on a framed architectural blueprint hanging behind the leather desk chair. I walked over and pulled the heavy frame away from the wall. Behind it, set flush into the drawer, was a digital biometric safe. It was forged from solid steel, completely impervious to a simple crowbar. I stared at the glowing keypad. There was no way I could guess the combination or bypass the fingerprint scanner. I needed a professional, and I needed one before the sun came up. During my 40 years in the cutthroat property development business in Chicago, I had crossed paths with many individuals who operated strictly in the shadows. I pulled my phone back out and dialed a number I had not called in over a decade. A man named Silas answered. He did not ask questions. I gave him the address and told him I needed a heavy drill job done immediately with absolute discretion. I promised him $5,000 in untraceable cash. Silas arrived at the side entrance less than 40 minutes later. He was a wiry man carrying a black duffel bag that clinked with specialized tools. He stepped into the dark study, shaking the cold rain from his jacket. He took one look at the shattered doors, the destroyed filing cabinets, and the safe embedded in the wall. He did not say a single word. He simply unzipped his bag, pulled out a heavy industrial drill equipped with a diamond-tipped bit, and went straight to work. The high-pitched screech of the drill biting into the solid steel filled the tense air. I stood by the window, watching the dark street, making sure no neighbors had been woken by the noise. As the grinding metal echoed around me, my mind raced through the cold-blooded legal strategy my son had constructed. I knew the laws of the state of Illinois intimately. When a person vanishes without a single trace, their family cannot simply claim their assets or empty their bank accounts. the law requires a strict waiting period to prevent fraud. A missing person must be gone for exactly 7 full years before a family member can petition a judge to have them officially declared dead in absentia. Next Friday marked exactly 7 years since Abigail disappeared. Next Friday was the exact date Valerie had circled in red ink in her planner with the word payday written right in the center. The terms of our family trust fund were explicitly clear. I had set aside $15 million to secure the future of my 2 children. If Abigail was declared legally dead without leaving behind a living heir, her entire share of this fortune would automatically default directly to her brother. Preston would inherit all $15 million in a single transfer. But if Abigail had a child, the law mandated that the child would inherit her entire portion of the trust. If the state of Illinois discovered that Toby existed, Preston and Valerie would not get a single penny. They had purposely hidden my grandson in a freezing basement to erase his existence from the legal record. They drugged him with tranquilizers to ensure he never made a sound that a neighbor might hear. They tortured an innocent child just to run out the 7-year legal clock. The drill whined louder, biting deeper into the locking mechanism. Silas wiped sweat from his forehead, leaning his body weight against the machine. I watched the metal shavings fall, my heart burning with a cold fury. Preston had driven his property development companies into total bankruptcy 2 years ago. He was completely broke, drowning in massive debt, relying entirely on fraudulent state foster care stipends just to keep up appearances. The $15 million trust payout was his only lifeline. It was the only way he could save himself from financial ruin. He had bet his future on the legal death of his sister, and he was willing to destroy a helpless 6-year-old boy to make sure he crossed that finish line. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the room. The whine of the drill stopped. Silas pulled his machine back, dropping it onto the floor with a heavy thud. He reached forward and grabbed the polished chrome handle. With a gentle pull, the thick steel door swung open smoothly, revealing the shadowy interior. Silas stepped back immediately, packing his tools into his black bag without looking inside the vault. I pulled an envelope filled with exactly $5,000 in cash from my pocket and handed it to him. He took the money, nodded once in silent acknowledgement, and slipped back out through the shattered doors into the pouring rain. I was completely alone again. I stepped up to the open safe, my hands trembling, as I raised my flashlight to illuminate the dark interior. The safe was not filled with hidden cash or expensive jewelry. It was filled with dark secrets. On the top shelf sat 3 cheap prepaid burner phones. They were bound together with a rubber band. Beside them was a tall, perfectly organized stack of legal documents. I reached in and pulled the heavy stack out, setting it on the edge of the ruined desk. The top document was a fully prepared, unfiled legal petition to the state court, formally requesting that Abigail Gallagher be declared legally dead in absentia. Preston had already signed the bottom line. He was just waiting for next Friday to file it. But it was the item resting at the very bottom of the safe that made my lungs seize. I reached my hand deep into the cold steel vault. My fingers brushed a hard plastic rectangle. I pulled it into the beam. It was an official driver license. I stared down at the small smiling photograph printed on the front of the plastic card. It was Abigail. It was her actual physical driver license, the one she carried the night she vanished. How did my son have her identification locked inside his hidden wall safe? The horrifying truth hit me. I stared at the small piece of plastic resting in my trembling palm. The smiling face of my beautiful daughter looked back at me from her official state driver license. It was the exact same photograph I had handed over to the Chicago police detectives 7 years ago. The edges of the card were slightly worn, carrying the physical memory of the girl who had placed it in her wallet before she vanished into the night. A suffocating wave of nausea washed over me. How did my son possess this? Why was the primary piece of identification of my missing daughter locked securely away inside his hidden wall safe? The answer was a dark, terrifying abyss that I was only just beginning to uncover. I set the plastic card down on the ruined mahogany desk and reached my hand back into the cold steel vault. My fingers brushed against something soft and textured, hidden in the very back corner of the bottom shelf. I pulled it out into the harsh beam of the flashlight. It was a thick, battered leather journal. The cover was heavily scratched and stained with dark watermarks bound shut by a frayed elastic band. I recognized the embossed sunflower pattern on the front immediately. I had bought her that exact journal during a family trip to Denver almost a decade ago. I sank down heavily onto the Persian rug, my legs completely giving out beneath me. I pulled the elastic band away and opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with messy, frantic handwriting in faded blue ink. It was the unmistakable, hurried script of Abigail. I held my breath and began to read. The first dozen pages were a painful, agonizing window into her darkest days. She wrote about the crushing weight of her addiction, the endless nights spent shivering in cheap, unheated apartments, and the profound, overwhelming shame that kept her from picking up the phone to call me. Reading her raw, unfiltered pain felt like taking a physical beating. I had spent years wondering what she was going through, wondering if she was cold or hungry or scared. The diary confirmed every single one of my worst nightmares. But as I turned the fragile pages, the tone of her writing began to subtly shift. The chaotic, desperate scribbles slowly transformed into neater, more deliberate paragraphs. An entry dated exactly 3 years ago marked a profound turning point in her tragic story. She wrote about a freezing morning in a rundown shelter when she realized she was pregnant. She described the terrifying, overwhelming surge of clarity that washed over her the moment she felt the first flutter of life inside her stomach. She wrote, "I cannot let my child grow up in this darkness. I have to get clean. I have to survive for him." The subsequent pages chronicled her grueling, agonizing journey through a state-mandated rehabilitation program. She detailed the physical withdrawals, the sleepless nights, and the fierce, unyielding determination to build a safe life for her unborn son. She named him Toby. Tears blurred my vision as I read about the day he was born. She filled entire pages describing his tiny fingers, his wide brown eyes, and the soft, quiet way he slept against her chest. She wrote about how much Toby reminded her of me. She wrote, "I wish Dad could see him. I wish I could go back to the house and sit on the front porch with him. I know I broke his heart when I ran away, but I am sober now. I am a mother now. I just want to go home and tell him how sorry I am. I want him to hold my son." I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, trying to stifle the heavy sobs tearing through my chest. My daughter had fought her way back from the edge of the abyss. She had beaten her demons. She had wanted to come home to me, but she made one fatal, tragic mistake. She was too ashamed to face me directly. She wrote that she was terrified I would reject her or look at her with deep disappointment. So she decided to reach out to the one person she thought she could trust to bridge the gap. She contacted her older brother. I turned the page, my heart hammering against my ribs with a sickening dread. Abigail detailed the emotional phone call she made to Preston. She wrote about how relieved she was when he answered, how he cried on the phone, and how he promised to help her transition back into the family. He told her to stay exactly where she was. He promised that he and Valerie would drive out to meet her, help her get settled, and prepare me for the emotional reunion. The journal entries over the next few days were filled with bright, fragile hope. Abigail wrote about Preston and Valerie arriving in a nice car, bringing warm clothes for Toby, and offering her a safe place to stay while they figured out the best way to break the news to me. She trusted them completely. She believed her big brother was saving her. But I knew the truth. Preston and Valerie were entirely broke. They were drowning in massive debt from their failed property development companies. When Abigail reached out to them, they did not see a sister seeking redemption. They saw a terrifying threat to their financial survival. If Abigail returned home with a living heir, The massive $15 million trust fund would be entirely out of their reach. Toby would inherit everything, and Preston would be left with nothing but his crushing bankruptcy. My hands shook violently as I reached the final few pages of the battered leather journal. The handwriting here was rushed, filled with an electric, nervous excitement. It was the eve of the promised reunion. Abigail thought she was finally coming home to me the very next morning. I read her words, every syllable burning itself permanently into my soul. She wrote, "Preston and Valerie are putting us up in a nice motel tonight, just outside the city limits. They bought Toby a new winter coat. I am so nervous, I can barely breathe. We see Dad tomorrow morning. Preston says he is going to be so happy to see us. Valerie just brought me a celebratory drink to help me calm my nerves. It tastes a little weird, but I am just so grateful for them. I cannot wait to hug my dad." That was the last sentence she ever wrote. The ink trailed off slightly at the end of the page as if her hand had suddenly grown heavy and slipped from the paper. There were no more entries. There were no more hopes, no more dreams, no more plans for a joyful reunion. The terrifying implications of that final paragraph hung in the freezing air of the ransacked study. Valerie had brought her a celebratory drink. It tasted weird. They had poisoned her. My own son and his wife had driven to that motel, looked my daughter in the eyes, and handed her a lethal dose of whatever toxic chemical they had acquired. They watched her drink it. They watched her die. And then they took my grandson. They scooped up the helpless, innocent boy, packed up the driver license and the diary to erase her identity, and likely disposed of her body in a place where no one would ever find her. They kept Toby alive only because they needed to use him as a ghost. They locked him in the basement, drugged him into submission, and created a fake identity to harvest state foster care stipends while they waited for the 7-year legal clock to run out. They traded the life of my beautiful daughter for a $15 million payday. The grief that had paralyzed me for the last hour instantly evaporated. The tears dried on my face. I closed the leather journal and placed it carefully into my coat pocket next to the fraudulent bank statements. The devastating sorrow inside my heart was completely consumed by a cold, absolute, and terrifying rage. I was no longer a mourning father trying to find a missing child. I was an executioner, and I was going to tear their entire world down to the bloody foundations. I set the leather journal onto the floor. It was the final testament of my daughter. My eyes shifted to the 3 cheap, prepaid burner phones I had pulled from the steel safe. They sat in a neat stack on the ruined mahogany desk. I picked up the top phone. It was completely dead, the internal battery drained from years, sitting uselessly in the dark. I picked up the second one. It was also dead. But when I pressed the power button on the third phone, the screen flickered to life. It glowed with a harsh, bright light that illuminated the dust floating in the cold air of the study. My thumb hovered over the unlocked screen. I knew whatever was waiting inside this plastic was going to be the final nail in the coffin for my son and his wife. I tapped the icon for the messaging application. There was only one conversation thread saved on the device. The contact was saved under a single initial, the letter C. I scrolled to the top of the thread. The timestamps on the messages dated back exactly 7 years. It was the same week Abigail had written her final diary entry in that lonely motel room. I took a deep, steadying breath and began to read the digital exchange. The messages were entirely between Valerie and this unknown contact. The cold, clinical nature of their conversation made my stomach physically churn. Valerie was not speaking like a panicked woman who had made a terrible mistake. She was negotiating like a ruthless business executive. The lack of human empathy in her typed words was staggering. The first message from Valerie was short and direct. She wrote, "The package is asleep. I gave her the drink with the extra dosage you provided tonight. She did not even notice the taste until the very end. She is completely unresponsive now. How long until her heart stops entirely?" I read the words over and over, my mind struggling to process the sheer evil of her actions. Valerie had referred to my daughter as a package. She had handed Abigail a lethal cocktail of drugs, smiled at her, and watched her drink it. The contact replied a few minutes later. He wrote, "Give it 20 minutes. The compound is untraceable, but it needs time to shut down the central nervous system. Make sure you wipe down all the glasses in the motel room. Do not leave any fingerprints behind. We cannot afford loose ends." The calculated nature of their plot was terrifying. They had planned this murder flawlessly. I continued scrolling down the bright screen, the horrifying truth unfolding message by message. Valerie texted back, "I am wiping everything down right now." Preston is pacing the floor downstairs. He is a nervous wreck tonight, but I reminded him what is at stake here. If she meets with Thomas tomorrow, the entire $15 million trust fund is gone forever. She has a kid, see. If we do not handle this tonight, the brat gets all the money and we lose the house. We lose everything. I stared at the glowing text, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears. They murdered my daughter for a house. They murdered her for imported luxury cars and expensive vacations to Cancun. They snuffed out her bright life simply because her existence threatened their empty, shallow lifestyle. They traded her flesh and blood for a bank account they did not earn. The conversation shifted to the aftermath of the murder. The contact wrote, "I am pulling up to the back of the motel now. Have the heavy plastic bags ready. We need to move fast before the sun comes up. I have a secure location selected deep in the state forest. No one will ever find her out there." I felt a violent shudder rack my entire body. My beautiful daughter, who had fought so hard to get clean, who had dreamed of bringing her newborn son home to me, had been stuffed into a plastic garbage bag. She had been dumped in a shallow, unmarked grave in the middle of a dark forest, discarded like meaningless trash. For 7 years, I paid private investigators to search the country for her. I had spent countless nights walking the streets of Chicago, handing out flyers, hoping she would come home. All that time she was lying in the cold dirt, put there by the greed of her own brother. But the chilling part of the digital conversation was yet to come. The contact sent another message. "What do you want to do with the kid? I can handle him too. It will cost you an extra $10,000, but it is much cleaner. No loose ends, Valerie. You need to think about the long-term risks." The response from Valerie made my blood run entirely cold. She wrote, "No, do not touch the boy. If the police ever start digging, 2 missing people look a lot more suspicious than 1 runaway addict. We will take the boy back to our house. We can lock him in the utility room down in the basement. I have a friend who works in the state medical system. She can forge some diagnostic paperwork and register him under a fake identity as a special needs foster placement. We can easily make a steady profit off him while we wait out the clock." The final messages in the thread outlined their entire sickening 7-year timeline. Valerie explained the strategy with terrifying precision. She typed, "The trust fund rules are completely clear. We just have to keep the kid hidden and keep him absolutely quiet for 7 years. We dose him with the tranquilizers when we have company over. We collect the state stipend every single month to pay our personal bills. Once the 7-year mark hits next Friday, we file the official paperwork to have Abigail declared legally dead in absentia. Thomas will be completely devastated, but he will sign the trust release forms. Preston inherits the $15 million. Once the massive payout clears our offshore accounts, we can safely dump the kid back into the state system and walk away as multimillionaires. It is the perfect, flawless plan." I reached the very bottom of the bright digital screen. There were no more messages. I slowly lowered this burner phone, placing it next to the battered leather journal on the mahogany desk. The sheer magnitude of their depravity was almost impossible to comprehend. My son and his wife had engineered a masterpiece of absolute human cruelty. They had murdered a mother, stolen her child, and tortured him in a freezing, windowless dungeon. They had weaponized my grief, using my desperate search for Abigail as a smokescreen, while they drained state funds to pay for their designer clothes. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect untouchable crime. They thought they were completely invincible. But they had made one monumental fatal mistake tonight. They had willingly left me alone in their house with a broken pipe and a shivering, terrified boy. They had handed me the very keys to their total destruction. The pale light of early dawn began to filter through the shattered French doors of the home office. The relentless rainstorm that had battered the suburban fortress all night had finally slowed to a steady drizzle. I sat still on the expensive Persian rug, surrounded by the physical wreckage of the perfect life my son had fabricated. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe hung open behind me. Spread out across my lap were the tools of his betrayal, the fraudulent bank statements, the battered diary, the official driver license, and the prepaid burner phone glowing faintly in the dim morning light. My body was numb, exhausted from the agonizing revelations, but my mind was moving with terrifying clarity. I had spent 7 long years searching for a ghost, pouring my wealth and soul into finding a daughter who was already dead. She had been murdered in a cheap motel room by the very people who stood beside me at family dinners. I carefully placed the burner phone next to the journal. The digital messages detailing the execution of my beautiful Abigail burned in my memory. They had poisoned her. They stuffed her lifeless body into a heavy plastic bag and discarded her in an unmarked grave deep in the state forest. And then they returned to this immaculate house, locked her newborn son in the freezing basement, and spent the next 7 years using his hidden existence to drain state funds. They tortured my grandson with animal tranquilizers and starvation just to run out the legal clock on a massive trust fund payout. The sheer evil required to execute such a plan was staggering. I closed my eyes, resting my head back against the solid mahogany desk. I tried to picture the smiling face of Abigail, but all I could see was the terrified, bruised face of the small boy hiding behind the water heater. The sudden vibration of my cell phone shattered the quiet morning air. My eyes snapped open. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled the device out, the bright screen illuminating the shadows of the ruined study. The caller identification displayed the name of Dr. Eris. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I had left Toby in the protective care of my trusted friend just hours ago, asking him to rush an off-the-books genetic panel. I stared at the ringing phone, my thumb hovering over the green button. I already knew the truth in my heart. I had known it the second the rusty music box fell from the trembling hands of that boy. But hearing the scientific confirmation was a threshold I knew I could never uncross. Once the words were spoken out loud, the nightmare would become inescapable reality. I braced myself, swiped the screen, and pressed the cold glass of the phone to my ear. Thomas, the weary voice of Dr. Eris sounded incredibly fragile. "I am sorry to call you so early. I know you have had a harrowing night, but the private laboratory just sent over the expedited results." He pushed the samples to the front of the testing queue. I swallowed hard, my mouth completely dry. "Tell me," I whispered, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Just tell me the truth, doctor." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear a medical chart being turned. "Thomas, the genetic markers are a definitive match," he said quietly. "The swab we took from Toby shares a 99.9% genetic correlation with the hair sample from Abigail. There is absolutely no margin for error here. The boy locked in that basement is her biological son. Toby is your grandson." The words washed over me, heavy and absolute. I lowered the phone, slowly ending the call without saying another word. The phone slipped from my loose grip, falling softly onto the thick carpet. The undeniable piece of the puzzle clicked violently into place. For a long moment, I could not breathe. I could not move. And then the dam finally broke. A raw sob tore through my chest, echoing loudly in the ransacked office. I buried my face in my trembling hands and wept. I wept for my brave daughter. I cried for the agonizing journey she had taken to get clean, for the fierce love she had felt for her baby, and for the vulnerable steps she had taken to bridge the gap between us. She had trusted her older brother to bring her safely home. She walked right into a lethal trap, completely unaware that the people she asked for help only saw her as a $15 million threat to their empty lifestyle. The tears flowed freely, hot and bitter, carrying the immense weight of 7 years of accumulated grief. I thought about all the birthdays I had missed, all the holidays I had spent, staring at the front door, praying she would walk through it. She had been so close. She had been just one motel room away from my embrace. If I had reached out to her first, if I had not let my stubborn pride create that distance, she might still be alive. She might be sitting in my kitchen right now, drinking coffee and watching her son play in the backyard. But Preston and Valerie had stolen that future. They snatched her life away and replaced it with a dark, freezing dungeon for her only child. They forced my grandson to live like a captive animal, slowly starving him in the shadows while they drank wine upstairs. I stayed on the floor for a long time, letting the devastating sorrow wash over me until I felt completely hollow inside. The rain outside finally stopped, leaving a heavy silence over the suburban neighborhood. I slowly lowered my hands from my face. I looked at the wet tears staining the cuffs of my thick winter coat. And then something deep inside my chest began to shift. The paralyzing grief that had weighed me down for the last 7 years began to evaporate. It did not disappear, but it transformed. It hardened, cooling into something sharp, dense, and infinitely more dangerous. The sadness was completely consumed by a terrifying, absolute rage. It was not a chaotic, explosive anger. It was a methodical, freezing fury that sharpened every single one of my senses. I wiped the remaining tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. I stared at the stack of evidence resting on the mahogany desk. I was no longer a mourning, desperate father wandering the streets with missing person flyers. I was no longer the generous, trusting patriarch who handed his property empire over to an ungrateful son. That version of Thomas Gallagher had died in this room today. He had been murdered alongside Abigail. The man sitting on the floor right now was an executioner. I would build a flawless, invisible guillotine for my son and his wife. I gathered the burner phones, the diary, and the bank statements, slipping them securely into my pockets. I stood up, my spine perfectly straight, ready to unleash absolute hell upon them. The sun had fully risen, casting a cold gray light over the ruined mahogany desk and the scattered documents. I stood in the center of the wreckage, my mind operating with a terrifying mechanical precision. If Preston returned from his luxurious vacation in Cancun and saw this complete destruction, he would immediately know that his dark secrets had been uncovered. He would take the remaining stolen money, flee the country, and I would never get the justice my daughter deserved. I could not ever allow that outcome to happen. I needed him to walk blindly into the inescapable trap I was going to set. I immediately began gathering the files I had thrown onto the Persian rug. I sorted through the mundane utility bills and the property tax receipts, placing them back into the metal filing cabinets in the exact order I had found them. I closed the bent drawers, applying pressure to the damaged steel until it popped back into its original shape. I moved to the scattered books, picking them up one by one and arranging them meticulously on the wooden shelves. I wiped away the metal shavings from the floor where Silas had drilled through the solid steel safe. The broken safe was the biggest problem. I could not simply leave a gaping hole in the wall. I pulled out my phone and searched for the exact make and model of the biometric vault. It was a high-end commercial unit, but not an uncommon one. I found a specialized security retailer downtown that had the exact same model in stock. I drove to the store, paid $3,000 in cash, and carried the heavy steel box back to my truck. I returned to the house, carefully removed the drilled safe from the wall cavity, and slid the brand new replica perfectly into the empty space. I programmed a random numeric code into the fresh keypad, ensuring the digital screen glowed with the exact same green light as the original. I hung the framed architectural blueprint back over the wall, hiding the fresh steel entirely from view. The final task was the shattered patio door. I drove to a local hardware store, purchased heavy-duty wood glue, matching paint, and a replacement locking mechanism. I spent 2 painstaking hours repairing the splintered wooden frame, sanding it down smoothly, and applying a fresh coat of dark stain so the damage was invisible. I swept the floors, wiped down the desk, and removed every trace of my presence. When I finally stood back and surveyed the inner sanctum, it looked completely untouched. It was a pristine, flawless illusion. I slipped out the side door, locking the new deadbolt firmly behind me. I walked to my truck, my pockets heavy with the tragic diary, the burner phones, and the damning bank statements. I drove away from the suburban fortress, leaving the horrific secrets safely buried inside. The next 48 hours were a blur of absolute calculated action. I did not sleep. I barely ate. I operated purely on the cold, burning adrenaline of a father seeking total retribution. My first call was to Jonathan Reed. Jonathan was not just a corporate lawyer. He was a ruthless, brilliant legal strategist who had handled my most hostile corporate takeovers decades ago. I was a man who understood exactly how to dismantle an enemy piece by piece without ever letting them see the sharp blade falling. I met him at a secluded diner on the outskirts of the sprawling city. I placed the evidence on the table between us. I watched his face turn pale as he read the messages describing the murder of Abigail and the systematic torture of Toby. Jonathan did not offer empty condolences. He simply nodded, his eyes hardening with professional fury. He told me we needed to bypass the local police entirely. This was too big, too complex, and too deeply rooted in financial fraud to risk a sudden leak. We needed federal and state authority. Jonathan spent the next day utilizing every high-level connection he possessed. He bypassed the standard bureaucratic channels and went directly to the absolute top of the judicial food chain. He secured a private, completely off-the-books meeting with District Attorney Harrison Miller, the most feared and respected prosecutor in the entire state. Harrison was known globally for his absolute refusal to offer plea deals to violent, remorseless criminals. Jonathan also reached out to Director Evelyn Torres, the regional head of Child Protective Services. She was a hardened veteran of the broken system who had spent 30 years fighting for abused children. We desperately needed her absolute authority to secure Toby the moment the trap was sprung. We had to guarantee the boy would not be lost in the chaotic shuffle of the state foster care system. While Jonathan orchestrated the legal heavyweights, I focused entirely on the impending financial guillotine. I contacted my personal bankers and the chief administrators of the $15 million family trust fund. I quietly initiated the complex legal paperwork required to completely freeze the massive corporate accounts. I set up a secondary highly secure trust exclusively in the name of Toby, ensuring that every single penny of the fortune would bypass Preston completely. I deeply wanted my son to return from his luxurious vacation, expecting a massive, life-changing payday only to find his hands completely empty. I wanted him to feel the exact same terror, isolation, and utter helplessness that he had violently inflicted upon my innocent daughter and my fragile grandson. By Thursday evening, everything was finally in perfect place. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and bitterly cold. I drove to an unmarked, highly secure building in the downtown financial district. The underground parking garage was completely empty. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, my heart beating with a steady, rhythmic determination. I walked down a long, dimly lit hallway and opened the heavy oak door at the very end. The room inside was dark, illuminated only by the soft yellow glow of a single desk lamp resting in the center of a long mahogany conference table. The air was thick with serious, unspoken tension. I stepped into the room and closed the door firmly behind me. Sitting around the large table were the powerful architects of the incoming destruction of my son. Jonathan Reed sat on the left, his leather briefcase open, meticulously organizing the printed transcripts of the burner phone messages. Across from him sat the district attorney, a tall, imposing man with sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Next to him was the director of Child Protective Services, her expression tight with restrained maternal anger. They had all reviewed the undeniable evidence. They had all seen the disturbing photographs of the bruises on Toby and read the horrifying final diary entries of Abigail. They knew exactly what kind of absolute monsters we were dealing with tonight. I walked to the head of the dark table and took my seat. The heavy silence stretched on for a moment as the three powerful figures looked at me, waiting for my command. I placed the rusted music box onto the polished wood, the tarnished metal gleaming softly under the desk lamp. I looked directly at the district attorney, my voice calm and completely devoid of any hesitation or fear. "My son lands at the international airport tomorrow afternoon," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his sharp eyes. "I thinks he is coming home to celebrate a $15 million inheritance. He thinks he committed the perfect, untraceable murder. I want you to tell me exactly how we are going to tear his life apart the second he walks through his front door." The district attorney leaned forward, his hands folded on the dark mahogany table. He looked a meticulously synchronized tactical operation. The police would not simply kick the door down and storm the property. That would give Preston a chaotic window to destroy evidence or claim ignorance. Instead, we were going to let him walk comfortably into his own castle, unaware that the walls had already closed in around him. We finalized the perimeter details, ensuring Child Protective Services would be positioned safely in the blind spot of the driveway to secure Toby the moment the handcuffs clicked. I left the meeting feeling a profound sense of finality. The wheels of justice were finally in motion. The next morning I was sitting in my kitchen staring at the blank wall when my cell phone chimed with an incoming text message. It was a group text from Valerie. She wrote, "Hey Thomas, the weather in Cancun took a bad turn today. We decided to change our flights and head back early. We should be landing in Chicago by 4 this afternoon. Hope the plumber fixed the basement leak." I stared at the bright screen, feeling a cold smile creep across my face. They were rushing home early to ensure everything was perfectly in place for the massive payday they believed was waiting for them next week. I typed my response, making sure my tone was effortlessly warm and completely oblivious to their dark crimes. I wrote, "That is wonderful news, Valerie. The leak is totally fixed. Let me come over and cook a welcome home dinner for you. I will make the famous pot roast of my late wife." Preston replied less than a minute later. He wrote, "That sounds amazing, Dad. We are starving. See you at the house." I set the phone down on the counter. The sheer audacity of their comfort was staggering. They were casually texting me about a home-cooked meal, while my abused grandson was recovering in a private medical clinic, and my murdered daughter was lying in an unmarked grave. I went to the grocery store and purchased the ingredients. I bought thick beef, fresh carrots, organic potatoes, and heavy red wine. As I stood in the checkout line, my mind drifted back to the origins of this specific meal. When my wife was still alive, her Sunday pot roast was the ultimate symbol of unconditional family love. It was the meal she cooked every single time our children came home from college, the meal we shared during holidays, and the meal that brought us together after every bitter argument. She used to say that no matter how broken a family was, a warm meal could always start the healing process. I was preparing her sacred recipe today, but I was not cooking it to heal our family. I was cooking it as a final poetic funeral rite for the son I was about to completely destroy. I drove to the upscale suburban fortress of my son and let myself in through the front door. The house was exactly as I had left it. The pristine marble floors shined, and the expensive vanilla candles sat unlit on the counters. I walked into the massive custom kitchen and went to work. I chopped the vegetables with methodical precision. the sharp blade of the chef knife hitting the wooden cutting board in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. I seared the heavy beef in a cast iron skillet, letting the rich, savory aroma fill the vast, empty rooms of the house. I placed the roast into the oven and set the timer. As the comforting smell of home cooking drifted through the air, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed the direct line to the district attorney. "I am inside the house," I said quietly, watching the rain clouds gather outside the large bay window. "The dinner is in the oven. They will be arriving in exactly 2 hours." The voice of this prosecutor was sharp and entirely professional. "The perimeter is already being established, Thomas," he replied. "We have unmarked vehicles positioned at both ends of the street. My tactical team is currently staging behind the tall hedges of the neighboring property. Director Torres from Child Protective Services is sitting in a black sedan in the alleyway behind the garage. We have complete visual coverage of the entire perimeter. No one is getting in or out without our absolute permission. When they walk through the front door, you have exactly 10 minutes to keep them occupied in the dining room. Once you have them seated, you give us the signal, and we will breach the property from all sides." I thanked him and ended the call. I spent the next hour setting the large dining room table. I placed expensive porcelain plates, polished silver cutlery, and crystal wine glasses at 3 distinct settings. I wanted the illusion to be absolutely flawless. I wanted Preston to feel completely safe, wrapped in the comforting embrace of a loving father and a warm home. I wanted his sudden fall from grace to be the most terrifying, disorienting experience of his miserable life. The oven timer beeped loudly, breaking the heavy silence of the house. I pulled the heavy cast-iron pot out and set it on the stove. The rich, delicious smell of the pot roast was completely overpowering now. I checked my reflection in the polished stainless steel of the refrigerator door. I did not look like an executioner. I looked like a sweet, tired, clueless grandfather waiting for his successful children to return from a tropical vacation. I walked into the living room and stood by the large front window, hiding myself slightly behind the thick, expensive curtains. I stared out at the quiet, manicured street. The unmarked police vehicles were completely invisible, perfectly blending into the affluent suburban landscape. The trap was fully set. The steel jaws were open, waiting for the rats to blindly wander inside. A sleek black Uber pulled into the long, winding driveway. The heavy tires crunched softly against the wet gravel. The vehicle came to a smooth stop right in front of the grand pillared entrance. My heart began to pound with a slow, heavy, and terrifying rhythm. The rear passenger doors swung open simultaneously. Preston and Valerie stepped out onto the pristine driveway. They were deeply tanned, glowing with the careless, relaxed energy of people who believed they had successfully conquered the world. Valerie was laughing brightly at something Preston said, her blonde hair perfectly styled. Preston smiled, looking incredibly handsome and confident in his expensive resort wear. They reached into the trunk of the car and pulled out several large designer shopping bags, no doubt filled with luxurious souvenirs purchased with the stolen foster care stipends of my tortured grandson. They walked up the stone steps toward the front door, holding hands, looking like the absolute picture of modern, wealthy perfection. The heavy oak door swung open, and they stepped into the trap. I stood in the shadows of the living room as they stepped into the grand foyer, bringing a sudden rush of cold wind with them. They laughed brightly, completely oblivious to the invisible eyes watching them from the perimeter of their massive property. Preston quickly kicked off his wet designer shoes and carelessly dropped his heavy travel bag onto the pristine marble floor. He took a deep breath, his eyes widening in pleasant surprise. "That smells absolutely incredible," he called out, his voice echoing loudly through the house. "It smells exactly like Mom used to make." I stepped out from behind the thick curtains, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. I took a slow breath and forced the warmest, most genuine smile I could muster onto my face. "Welcome home," I said smoothly, walking forward to greet them. I pulled Preston into a brief embrace. He smelled like expensive cologne and tropical sunscreen. Valerie leaned in and kissed my cheek, her designer jewelry clinking softly. "We are so glad you are here, Thomas," Valerie chirped, slipping off her coat. "The flight was completely exhausting, and the weather here is just miserable compared to the beach. But walking into a house that smells like a home-cooked meal makes it all worth it." She glanced down the hallway toward the kitchen. "Did my little autistic nephew give you any trouble today, Dad?" she asked casually, her voice completely devoid of any real concern. She asked the question with the same light tone one might use to ask about a leaky faucet. I kept my smile perfectly fixed. "He was no trouble at all, Valerie," I replied evenly. "The plumber fixed the pipe, and I made sure the basement door was securely locked before I came upstairs to start the roast. I am sure his nanny will return soon. Now why do you not both go wash up and sit down in the dining room? Dinner is completely ready." They happily agreed, disappearing into the master bathroom to freshen up. I walked back into the kitchen and carried the heavy cast iron pot into the formal dining room. I set it down in the absolute center of the long mahogany table surrounded by polished silver and glowing crystal wine glasses. Preston and Valerie emerged a few minutes later, looking refreshed and remarkably relaxed. They sat down across from me, pouring themselves generous glasses of the heavy red wine I had opened earlier. I picked up the serving utensils and began slicing the thick beef, placing large portions onto their expensive porcelain plates. We clinked our glasses together in a cheerful toast. "To a safe trip home," I said softly. Preston took a long sip of his wine, sighing in deep satisfaction. "This is exactly what we needed, Dad. The trip was amazing, but running a development empire takes a serious toll. We really needed the break." I listened to his brazen lie without flinching. I knew his companies had been dead and bankrupt for 2 years. I knew he was drowning in debt. I knew every piece of food on his plate and every drop of wine in his glass was paid for with the stolen foster care stipends of my tortured grandson. But I simply nodded, eating my food with slow, deliberate bites. As we ate, I expertly shifted the flow of the conversation. I kept my tone soft, adopting the posture of a tired, grieving father reflecting on the past. "You know, Preston," I said, staring down at the dark wine swirling in my crystal glass, "I was thinking a lot about your mother today while I was cooking her famous recipe. I was thinking about how much she loved having this family together under one roof." Preston paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. His expression softened into a mask of practiced sympathy. "I know, Dad," he murmured. "We miss her every single day." I looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "And I was thinking about your sister too," I continued, my voice trembling just enough to sell the performance. "Next Friday is a heavy day for me, Preston. It marks exactly 7 years since Abigail disappeared." The atmosphere in the grand dining room shifted instantly. The casual, relaxed energy completely evaporated. Valerie carefully set her wine glass down on the polished table, her eyes darting quickly toward her husband. Preston cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. "I know, Dad," Preston said, his voice dropping into a low, somber register. "I know how hard this anniversary is going to be for you. I want you to know that Valerie and I are here for you. We can spend the entire day together if you want. We never stop praying that she will walk through that door again." I watched him deliver the sickening lie with flawless execution. He was looking me right in the eyes, offering me comfort for a tragedy he had personally orchestrated. He had poisoned her. He had dumped her body in a dark forest. And now he was sitting at his luxury dining table eating my food and pretending to mourn her. "I appreciate that, son," I whispered, keeping my hands perfectly still on my lap. "But we have to face the legal reality of the situation. My attorneys called me this morning to remind me about the family trust fund. Because it has been 7 full years without a single trace, the state of Illinois requires us to file the paperwork to have Abigail declared legally dead in absentia. If we do that, the $15 million trust will finally be settled. Her portion will default entirely to you, Preston. You will inherit the entire fortune next week. A brief, microscopic flash of pure, unadulterated greed crossed the face of Valerie. She quickly masked it by reaching over and gently placing her manicured hand over mine. "Oh, Thomas," she cooed softly. "We do not care about the money at all. We just want you to find some peace and closure. It is what Abigail would have wanted for you." I stared at her hand resting on mine. The very same hand that had mixed the lethal cocktail of drugs 7 years ago. The very same hand that locked the heavy deadbolts on the freezing basement door every single night. I slowly pulled my hand away from her grip. I gently placed my silver fork down on the edge of my porcelain plate. The soft clink of the metal against the china echoed loudly in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. I stopped eating completely. I sat back in my chair and looked directly across the table at the sun I had raised. The warmth and confusion vanished from my face, replaced by a terrifying, absolute coldness. "How much did the state pay you to foster the boy you locked in the basement, Preston?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a guillotine blade. For a fraction of a second, the universe inside that formal dining room simply stopped functioning. The charming, practiced smile on the face of my son did not just fade. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. His jaw went completely slack, and the healthy tropical color drained instantly from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, chalky pallor. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his brain violently misfiring as it tried to process the impossible reality that his darkest, most closely guarded secret had just been dragged out into the bright light of the dining room chandelier. Valerie was the first to attempt a recovery. She let out a high, thin laugh that sounded like cracking glass. "Oh, Thomas, what on earth are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice shaking violently, despite her desperate effort to keep it light and breezy. She reached for her crystal wineglass again, but her hand was trembling so badly that the dark red liquid sloshed over the delicate rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. "Did you misunderstand what Preston said on the phone earlier this afternoon? The boy in the basement is just my nephew. He has severe behavioral issues. We would never lock him away against his will." "You must be confused, Dad. You have been under so much extreme emotional stress lately. Let me go into the kitchen and get you a cold glass of water right now." I did not break eye contact with Preston. I did not blink. I reached my right hand slowly into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain beating against the large bay window and the rapid, terrified breathing of my son. I pulled my hand out. Resting in my open palm was the cheap black plastic burner phone I had extracted from the hidden wall safe in his office just 2 nights ago. I held it up so the polished silver chandelier illuminated the scratched, dirty screen. I watched the eyes of my son frantically track the object. I watched the absolute primal terror bloom in his pupils as he recognized the damning device he thought was securely buried behind a wall of solid steel. I moved my hand forward, holding the phone directly over his expensive porcelain plate. I opened my finger. The heavy plastic device dropped like a stone. It splashed violently into the center of his soup bowl, sending thick, dark brown gravy splattering across the fine china over the polished mahogany table and onto his crisp white designer shirt. Preston flinched backward as if he had been physically struck, his heavy chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "What are you doing?" he gasped, his voice completely stripped of its confident masculine resonance. He sounded exactly like a terrified, cornered child who had just been caught committing an unforgivable crime. I stared at the burner phone sinking slowly into the thick, savory stew. "That is the communication device your wife used to coordinate the disposal of a human body," I said, my voice eerily calm, completely devoid of the chaotic, screaming anger he likely expected. "I read every single message saved on that device, Preston. I read the messages where Valerie negotiated the cash price to have a professional cleaner drag a heavy plastic bag deep into the state forest, under the cover of darkness. I read the detailed messages where she meticulously planned to forge medical documents in order to secure state funding for a phantom foster child. I read the terrifying messages where she bragged about intentionally dosing my innocent grandson with black market animal tranquilizers just so you two could enjoy a quiet, undisturbed evening, drinking expensive wine with your wealthy suburban friends. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp, pressing both of her manicured hands tightly over her mouth, as if she could physically hold back the horrific truth that was now spilling out across the dining room table. Preston opened his mouth to speak, to deny the accusations, to spin another elaborate, desperate web of lies, but absolutely no sound came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence I had just presented. I reached into my jacket pocket one more time. I pulled out the battered leather journal with the embossed sunflower pattern on the cover. I placed it gently onto the table, smoothing my hand over the dark, wrinkled watermarks. I do not need to hear your pathetic excuses or your fabricated alibis. I continued leaning forward so my face was just inches from his trembling, cowardly form, because I already heard the tragic truth directly from the source. I found her personal diary, hidden in the false bottom of your desk drawer. I read her final desperate words, Preston. I know exactly what she was thinking the very night you selfishly took her life. The atmosphere in the elegant dining room plummeted to sub-zero. The air grew so incredibly thick and suffocating that it felt physically difficult to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. Preston stared down at the leather journal as if it were a venomous snake coiled perfectly on the mahogany table ready to strike. I did not need to open the fragile yellowed pages to recite the final entry. The words were permanently burned into my soul, etched into my mind with agonizing clarity. I kept my eyes locked onto his, delivering her final testament with slow, deliberate, and devastating precision. Preston and Valerie are putting us up in a nice motel tonight, just outside the city limits. I recited my voice, slicing through the silent room like a surgical scalpel. They bought Toby a new winter coat. I am so nervous I can barely breathe. We see Dad tomorrow morning. Preston says he is going to be so happy to see us. Valerie just brought me a celebratory drink to help me calm my nerves. It tastes a little weird, but I am just so grateful for them. I cannot wait to hug my dad. I stopped speaking. The haunting words of my murdered daughter hung in the freezing air, a damning, inescapable indictment of their absolute, unforgivable cruelty. I looked at the son I had raised, the boy I had loved unconditionally, the man I had blindly trusted with my entire life and my corporate legacy. She completely trusted you, I whispered, the cold, righteous fury finally bleeding into the sharp edges of my words. She came to you for help because she believed you were a good, honorable person. She believed her big brother was saving her from the darkness. And you sat in that cheap motel room. You looked her right in the eyes, and you watched her drink poison. You watched her heart stop beating, and then you stole her helpless child to fund your pathetic, bankrupt, entirely fake life. You traded the flesh and blood of your own sister for a sports car and a tropical vacation to Cancun. Valerie stood over the polished mahogany table, her chest heaving with furious, ragged breaths. The charming, sophisticated facade she wore for her wealthy suburban friends had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a desperate, vicious predator backed into a corner. You are a senile old fool, she spat, her voice trembling with an ugly, toxic mixture of hatred and sheer panic. You have absolutely no proof of any of these insane delusions. We will call the authorities right now and have you committed to a psychiatric ward. You are completely out of your mind, Thomas. Preston scrambled to his feet, his heavy dining chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. He raised his hands in a frantic, placating gesture, his eyes darting wildly between his raging wife and my perfectly calm face. Dad, please just listen to her, Preston stammered, his voice cracking pitifully in the tense air. You are not thinking clearly right now. You are just grieving for Abigail, and your mind is inventing these horrible, impossible scenarios to cope with the immense pain. Just put the phone and the diary away, and we can get you the medical help you clearly need. I sat perfectly still in my leather dining chair. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical shouting. I simply looked at the two monsters standing in front of me, absorbing their pathetic threats with a cold, impenetrable silence. They thought they could still manipulate the narrative to save themselves. They had assumed my grief made me blind to their sickening manipulation, entirely convinced that my desperate longing to find Abigail would keep me infinitely distracted, while they drained the state resources completely dry. They truly believed they could gaslight me into doubting my own sanity, just as they had manipulated the state foster care system for 7 long years. I slowly lowered my gaze to the polished surface of the table. I moved my hand past the stained china plate, past the ruined soup bowl containing the submerged burner phone, and picked up my own personal cell phone. I did not type a long, dramatic message. I simply opened the active text thread I had established with the district attorney and pressed a single pre-programmed button to send the signal. The screen illuminated my hand for a brief second before I placed the device face down on the wood. The room descended into a suffocating, heavy silence. Valerie glared at me, her hands balled into tight, aggressive fists at her sides, fully prepared to continue her vicious tirade against my mental state. But she never got the chance to speak another word. A soft, deliberate click echoed from the back of the house. The heavy, swinging door that separated the formal dining room from the massive custom kitchen began to push open. The sound of the door hinges swinging open made Preston freeze completely in his tracks. He slowly turned his head toward the kitchen, his eyes widening in absolute primal confusion. He knew the house was supposed to be completely empty. He knew the heavy deadbolts on the basement utility room were supposed to be securely locked from the outside. But as the wooden door swung fully open, the impossible reality of his total destruction walked right into the bright light of the dining room chandelier. It was Toby. The small, fragile boy did not look like the starving, terrified animal I had found wedged behind the water heater just a few days ago. The thick layer of grimy filth had been completely washed away from his pale skin. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he was wearing a perfectly tailored, clean, dark suit that hung slightly loose over his thin, recovering frame. I was no longer shivering from the freezing dampness of a concrete dungeon. He stood tall, his wide brown eyes blinking against the bright lights, holding firmly onto the hand of a stern, imposing woman dressed in a sharp business suit. It was Director Evelyn Torres, the regional head of Child Protective Services. She gripped the small hand of my grandson. With a fierce, protective, maternal strength, her dark eyes locking onto Valerie with a look of absolute, unapologetic disgust. Preston let out a strangled, breathless gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the expensive wallpaper of the dining room. His brain could not process the image standing in front of him. The secret captive he had tortured for 7 years was standing right inside his formal dining room, completely free and undeniably safe. Valerie opened her mouth, her face draining of all remaining color, turning as white as a sheet of heavy parchment. She took a slow, trembling step backward, her expensive designer heels slipping slightly on the polished hardwood, before either of them could formulate a single word of defense. The heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoed loudly from the kitchen corridor. Director Torres gently guided Toby to the side of the room, shielding his small body safely behind her own frame. Walking out from the shadows of the hallway was District Attorney Harrison Miller, his expression carved from solid stone. Following closely behind the fierce prosecutor was a squad of 6 heavily armed plainclothes detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. They stepped into the dining room with absolute synchronized precision, immediately fanning out to block every single possible exit from the house. The metallic clack of their utility belts and heavy boots shattered the illusion of the wealthy suburban sanctuary forever. The sheer, overwhelming presence of law enforcement completely suffocated the space. The detectives did not shout or draw their weapons. They did not need to. Their silent, towering authority was more than enough to crush the remaining spirit of the two cowards standing by the table. The intricate, flawless lie they had built over 7 years was officially destroyed. I remained seated, watching the scene unfold with a cold, detached satisfaction. I looked directly at Preston. The arrogant, wealthy property developer who had murdered my daughter for a trust fund was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, pathetic shell of a man. His knees buckled under the immense, crushing weight of his exposed crimes. Every single muscle in his body trembled as the sheer gravity of his horrific sins crashed down upon his shoulders. He looked up at the fierce detectives, his eyes wide and completely devoid of the arrogant, mocking confidence he possessed just moments ago. He sagged against the wall, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged, panicked wheezes as he realized there was no escape. As the lead detective stepped forward, reaching toward the silver handcuffs resting on his dark leather belt, a dark, spreading stain began to rapidly form on the front of the expensive, tailored trousers of my son. Preston collapsed onto the hardwood floor, weeping uncontrollably, wetting himself in absolute, unadulterated terror. He knew his life was finally over. The nightmare was ending for us, but for him, the absolute worst punishment was just beginning. The walls of his perfect fake reality had crumbled to dust, leaving nothing behind but the undeniable consequences of his pure greed. He had tried to bury the truth in a freezing basement, but the truth had broken out and come to collect its ultimate, inescapable debt. The crushing silence in the dining room shattered the moment the lead detective unclipped his radio. The burst of static feedback echoed off the ceilings, signaling the end. Preston was still crumpled on the floor, in a whimpering heap. The dark stain on his trousers spread across the polished wood. He looked up at the towering detectives, his chest heaving with violent gasps. He realized there was no lawyer who could save him. He realized the $15 million trust fund was gone forever. Most importantly, he realized he was going to spend the rest of his natural life rotting inside a federal prison. The terrifying weight of that reality broke whatever fragile, cowardly spirit he had left. Preston scrambled onto his knees, his hands slipping wildly against the slick floor. He did not look at me. He did not look at the grandson he had starved and tortured for 7 years. He snapped his head toward the detectives and raised a trembling finger, pointing directly at his wife. It was all her, Preston screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical shriek that tore through the dining room. I had nothing to do with it. She planned the entire thing. She bought the drugs. She mixed the poison into the drink at the motel. I tried to stop her. I swear to God I tried to stop her, but she forced me to help her move the body. I never wanted to hurt Abigail. It was Valerie. She killed my sister. She locked the boy in the basement. She forged the foster care documents. You have to believe me. I am a victim here too. She manipulated me. I was sobbing uncontrollably, now crawling backward on his hands and knees, desperate to put physical distance between himself and his wife. I was offering her up on a silver platter, throwing the woman he had vowed to love and protect under the bus just to save his own miserable skin. It was the ultimate display of spineless cowardice, a fitting conclusion for a man who possessed no moral center. Valerie stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second. The desperate accusations of her husband washed over her completely, severing the last remaining tether of her sanity. The color rushed back into her pale face, transforming her skin into a mottled, furious, burning crimson. The elegant society woman entirely vanished. She looked down at Preston weeping on the floor, her eyes burning with an explosive, homicidal rage. You spineless, pathetic little worm, she hissed, the venom in her voice making the hair on my arms stand up. I did everything for you. I secured our entire future while you drove your pathetic little companies into the ground. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Valerie spun around toward the polished mahogany table. Her manicured hand shot out her fingers, wrapping tightly around the heavy serrated silver steak knife resting next to her ruined dinner plate. She did not scream. She did not utter another word. She lunged directly across the room, the sharp blade raised high above her head, aiming straight for the chest of her husband. Preston shrieked in absolute terror, throwing his arms up over his face and curling into a tight defensive ball on the wet floor. The detectives reacted with blinding speed. Before Valerie could cross the distance and bury the steel blade into the neck of my son, the lead detective tackled her from the side. The sheer force of the impact lifted her completely off her heels. They crashed violently into the expensive china cabinet, shattering the glass doors and sending heavy crystal bowls raining down upon them. The steak knife flew from her grip, clattering harmlessly across the marble tiles of the hallway. 2 more detectives immediately piled on top of her, pinning her shoulders firmly against the floor, covered in broken glass. Valerie fought like a rabid-cornered animal. She thrashed wildly, kicking her legs and screaming incoherent curses at the officers at Preston and at me. The metallic heavy click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists finally ended the violent struggle. The detectives hauled her forcefully to her feet. She was breathing heavily, her pristine blonde hair tangled, and her silk blouse torn, completely stripped of all her artificial dignity. Preston was still curled on the floor, weeping and hyperventilating. 2 robust officers reached down, grabbed him by the arms of his tailored shirt, and hauled him roughly to his feet. They spun him around, slamming him face first against the custom wallpaper. Preston offered zero resistance. He just sobbed weakly as the cold steel handcuffs snapped securely around his own wrists. The commanding voice of the district attorney cut through the chaotic noise of the room, reciting the Miranda rights with a sharp, booming authority. As the detectives turned Preston around to march him out of his sprawling suburban fortress, forever his frantic, tear-filled eyes locked onto mine. He looked at me with the desperate, pleading gaze of a lost little boy. "Dad." He cried out, his voice cracking with absolute terror as the officers pushed him toward the grand foyer. "Dad, please. You have to help me. You have to get me a lawyer. I am your son. Please, Dad, do not let them take me away. I am your son." I stood up slowly from my dark leather dining chair. I walked calmly across the room, stepping carefully over the shattered crystal and the spilled wine. I stopped right in front of him, silently signaling the heavily armed detectives to pause for just a single quiet moment. I looked deep into his terrified, weeping eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned in close, ensuring my voice was the very last thing he ever heard before he was dragged out into the cold night. "You are no son of mine," I whispered. "You died to me the very night you killed my daughter." 3 weeks passed since that night in the dining room. I found myself standing in the suffocating darkness of a police observation room, my hands resting flat against the cold glass of a 2-way mirror. On the other side of the thick pane sat Preston. He was no longer dressed in designer silk shirts or imported leather shoes. He wore a standard-issue bright orange detention uniform that hung loosely over his rapidly thinning frame. The arrogant, wealthy property developer who had practically danced into my house after his tropical vacation was completely eradicated. In his place was a hollow, trembling shell of a man frantically bargaining for his own miserable life. District Attorney Harrison Miller sat across from him at the scarred metal table, his posture radiating absolute authority. A heavy tape recorder captured every sob and plea that spilled from the mouth of my former son. Preston was breaking. He was entirely terrified of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and he was perfectly willing to trade the darkest secrets of his wife to avoid the death penalty. I watched his hands shake as he reached for a paper cup of water, spilling half of it down his chin before he could swallow. He looked at the prosecutor with wide, bloodshot eyes and began to sing. He detailed the murder. He explained how Valerie sourced the animal tranquilizers from a corrupt contact in the veterinary supply industry. He described the cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, recounting how they had manipulated my vulnerable, recovering daughter into drinking the fatal cocktail under the guise of a celebratory toast. My chest tightened as I listened to the clinical, cowardly way he shifted the primary blame onto Valerie, painting himself as an unwilling hostage to her greed. But the district attorney did not care about his pathetic excuses. He only cared about the physical evidence. He leaned forward, tapping his pen against a detailed topographical map spread across the metal table. He demanded the exact location. Preston hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his survival instinct completely overrode his guilt. He pressed his trembling finger against a specific quadrant of the map deep inside the dense, sprawling acreage of the state forest. He described a shallow ravine hidden beneath a cluster of ancient oak trees roughly 3 miles off the main hiking trail. He told the detectives exactly where they had dragged the heavy plastic bags in the dead of night, burying my beautiful daughter in the cold, wet dirt so they could steal her child and harvest his inheritance. I stared through the glass, my expression perfectly stoic, but my soul felt as though it were being crushed under the weight of an entire mountain. The horrific mystery that had haunted my every waking moment for 7 grueling years was finally brutally solved. Down the hall, locked inside a separate, heavily guarded holding cell, Valerie was taking a very different approach. She had completely refused to speak to the detectives, invoking her right to legal counsel and maintaining a stony, venomous silence since the moment the handcuffs had clicked around her wrists. She foolishly believed that her absolute refusal to confess would somehow save her from the incoming legal avalanche. But she was entirely wrong. Her silence was completely meaningless now. Jonathan Reed in the Financial Crimes Division had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously ripping her fraudulent empire to shreds. They had uncovered the massive paper trail detailing her systematic theft of the state foster care stipends. They had matched her handwriting on the forged medical documents used to hide the true identity of Toby, coupled with the undeniable, absolute proof of the genetic DNA panel and the chilling text messages recovered from the hidden burner phone. The case against her was incredibly airtight. Her fate was permanently sealed behind a wall of insurmountable forensic evidence. She was never going to walk out of a prison cell ever again. The recovery operation commenced less than an hour after Preston pointed to the map. A massive team of forensic investigators and local law enforcement cordoned off the designated section of the state forest. By nightfall, the grim call came through. They had found the remains. The sudden explosive news of the discovery sent a massive shockwave through our affluent suburban community. The local television stations broadcasted relentless coverage of the scandal, detailing the horrific fall from grace of a prominent property developer who had locked a child in a basement and murdered his own sister for a trust fund payout. My neighbors, former business associates, and distant friends flooded my phone with messages of absolute disbelief and profound horror. They simply could not reconcile the charming, wealthy couple they knew from country club dinners with the cold-blooded monsters displayed on the evening news. I did not engage with the media circus. I ignored the chaotic noise of the outside world and focused entirely on bringing my daughter safely home. The confession allowed me to bypass the legal limbo of a missing persons case. I claimed her remains and immediately orchestrated the beautiful, dignified funeral she was cruelly denied 7 years ago. I chose a pristine cemetery overlooking a lake far from the dark shadows of the city. On the morning of the service, the sky was a brilliant crystal-clear blue. I stood by the polished mahogany casket, completely dressed in a sharp black suit, holding the small hand of Toby. I was wearing a dark jacket, his wide brown eyes looking up at me with a quiet, trusting innocence. I did not shed a single tear as they lowered my daughter into the earth. As the priest delivered the final solemn prayer, I simply looked down at the soft green grass and made a silent promise to the spirit of Abigail. Her murderers had been permanently caged, and her memory would be fiercely protected forever. The long months following the funeral were a grueling gauntlet of exhausting legal procedures and relentless media scrutiny. The spectacular downfall of my son had become a grim cautionary tale of absolute unchecked greed broadcast across every major news network. But I ignored the flashing cameras and shouting reporters camped outside the federal courthouse on the morning of the final sentencing hearing. I walked through the heavy stone archways with unwavering focus, Today was the culmination of the promise I made by the graveside of my daughter. The steel doors of the justice system would permanently close on the monsters who stole her life. A deliberate silence fell over the room the moment I walked down the central aisle. I took my designated seat in the front row. Sitting directly beside me was Toby. The transformation of my grandson over the past several months had been miraculous. The starving, terrified child I found shivering behind a basement water heater was completely gone. He was wearing a neat tailored dark suit that fit his recovering frame perfectly. His dark hair was brushed, and his cheeks held a healthy color. He was incredibly quiet, and loud noises still made him flinch, but he was healing. I reached out and wrapped my weathered hand around his small fingers. He gripped my hand back with a fierce, trusting strength. I was not going to let him witness this moment alone. He needed to see that the people who hurt him could never reach him again. A heavy metal door groaned open at the far side of the massive courtroom, drawing the collective anxious attention of everyone in the packed gallery. Two armed bailiffs stepped out, followed closely by the defendants. Preston and Valerie shuffled into the harsh fluorescent light, their wrists and ankles bound securely by thick steel chains that clinked loudly with every slow step. The stark reality of their prolonged incarceration had completely stripped away their carefully cultivated suburban glamour. Preston wore an oversized bright orange detention jumpsuit that swallowed his thinning frame. His posture was completely defeated, his shoulders slumped forward as if he were carrying a boulder on his back. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the scuffed floor tiles, terrified of meeting the judging gaze of the room. Valerie walked closely behind him, but her demeanor was entirely different. Her expensive blonde hair had faded into a dull, unkempt, stringy gray that hung limply around her pale face. She walked with a rigid defiance, her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping in her cheeks. She was vibrating with a toxic, suppressed rage, glaring at the judge, the prosecutor, and finally at me. When her hateful eyes locked onto mine, I did not look away. I stared back at her with a cold, impenetrable calm completely impervious to her silent threats. She had lost her power. She was nothing more than a caged predator waiting for her final sentence. They took their seats at the defense table, their heavy chains rattling against the wooden chairs. District Attorney Harrison Miller stood up from his table. He did not need to deliver a long, closing argument. The overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence, the recovered text messages, the fraudulent bank records, and the damning biological timeline had already done all the heavy lifting. He turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "the individuals sitting before you today did not commit a crime of sudden passion. They executed a prolonged, deeply calculated, and breathtakingly cruel campaign of absolute, unadulterated greed that shocked the entire city. They murdered a vulnerable mother in cold blood, buried her in an unmarked grave, and systematically tortured her helpless child in a freezing dungeon for 7 years. They did this not to survive, but to fund luxury vacations and purchase sports cars." The presiding judge, a very stern man with decades of hard experience on the criminal bench, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the two trembling defendants. The silence in the courtroom stretched out thick and suffocating. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was laced with a deep, personal disgust. "I have presided over this court for 30 years, the judge stated. "I have seen the absolute darkest corners of human nature. But the profound lack of basic human empathy displayed by both of you is truly staggering. You weaponized the love of a grieving father. You weaponized the vulnerability of a helpless child. You traded the sanctity of human life for mere financial gain. There is no rehabilitation for the malice you possess. There is only separation from decent society." The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "Therefore, on the charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated child abuse, I sentence you both to the maximum penalty allowed by the law. You are hereby remanded to the custody of the federal penitentiary system to serve consecutive sentences of life in prison." This sentence is handed down entirely without the possibility of parole. You will never walk free again. The heavy gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that signaled the absolute end of their lives. Preston immediately collapsed forward, burying his face into his chained hands. He wept openly for his ruined reputation and for his completely squandered freedom. But Valerie did not weep. The moment the gavel struck the block, the fragile thread holding her sanity together completely snapped. She shot up from her chair, kicking the heavy wooden furniture backward with an explosive burst of energy. "You senile, meddling old bastard!" she screamed at the very top of her lungs, her voice tearing violently through the silent courtroom like a jagged, rusty blade. The armed bailiffs lunged forward immediately, grabbing her arms and wrestling her toward the heavy side door. She thrashed wildly against their grip, her face contorted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "This is all your fault, Thomas," she shrieked, spitting the words across the room as the officers dragged her away. "You ruined everything. You should have minded your own business. I hope you burn in hell for what you did to us." The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical screaming. The courtroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence. The onlookers stared in absolute shock, but I remained perfectly still in my seat. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a single word of response. I simply squeezed the small hand of my brave grandson tighter, assuring him silently that the evil monster was gone. I stood up slowly. I looked down at Toby, offering him a gentle, reassuring smile. "It is over now," I whispered. "We can finally go safely home." I turned my back to the empty defense table. I walked down the central aisle of the courtroom, my footsteps steady on the polished floor. I pushed open the heavy double doors, leaving the stifling courthouse behind me. Toby and I stepped out onto the wide concrete steps. The warm, bright sunlight washed over us, chasing away the cold ghosts of the past as we walked forward into our new life. The bright sunlight of that afternoon did not mark the end of my work. It was merely the signal that the final, systematic dismantling of the dark legacy my son had built could officially begin. I did not waste a single day. The very next morning, I drove directly to the high-rise offices of Jonathan Reed. I sat in his familiar leather chair and instructed him to initiate the absolute merciless liquidation of every single asset Preston and Valerie had acquired. Because I was the primary lionholder on their massive suburban fortress and had officially seized control of their bankrupt development firms, I had the legal authority to strip them completely bare. We put the $2 million house on the market immediately. I did not care about waiting for the best possible offer. I instructed the real estate agents to price it for a rapid cash-only sale. The pristine marble floors and vaulted ceilings where they had plotted the murder of my daughter were sold to a completely oblivious young couple within a week. I watched as the moving trucks hauled away the imported Italian furniture and the designer clothing. We liquidated the luxury sports cars, selling the expensive vehicles back to the dealerships at a steep loss. I gathered every single dollar generated from the rapid sale of their estate. I did not keep a penny of it for myself or for my grandson. Instead, Jonathan and I calculated the exact amount of money Preston and Valerie had fraudulently stolen from the state foster care system over the course of 7 years. We drafted a massive certified check and delivered it directly to the Regional Office of Child Protective Services, returning the stolen stipends to the vulnerable children who actually needed them. It felt incredibly satisfying to watch the toxic, stolen wealth completely evaporate from our family records. But liquidating the physical property was only the first step in my cleansing process. I needed to perform a much deeper, far more personal eradication. I drove back to my own quiet home and walked into the grand study where I kept the archives of our family history. I pulled down the heavy leather-bound photo albums from the top shelves. I sat at my desk and meticulously went through every single page. Whenever I found a photograph of Preston, I pulled it from the plastic sleeve. I did not look at his smiling face with any lingering sentimentality or regret. I simply fed the pictures into the heavy-duty paper shredder resting beside my desk. I watched the sharp metal blades violently chew through the glossy paper, reducing the false memories of family vacations and holiday dinners into tiny, meaningless strips of garbage. I contacted my corporate attorneys and officially removed the name of my son from every single business charter development patent and historical company record I had ever filed in the state of Illinois. I wanted it to be as if he had never existed at all. I wanted to guarantee that if anyone ever researched the Gallagher property development empire in the future, they would find absolutely no mention of the cowardly monster who had poisoned his own sister. He had traded his birthright for a cheap motel room murder, and I was making his exile absolute. The void he left behind was immense, but it was not empty for long. I was actively clearing the space to build a completely new, infinitely purer foundation for the only family member who truly mattered to me now. With the toxic remnants of my former son completely swept away, I turned my entire focus toward the future of Toby. I returned to the downtown financial district to finalize the massive transfer of the family wealth. I sat in a secure conference room with the chief administrators of the $15 million trust fund. The legal documents declaring Abigail officially deceased had been processed, but the narrative had been entirely rewritten by the undeniable DNA evidence and the criminal convictions. The money was no longer in any danger of defaulting to Preston. I authorized the immediate irrevocable transfer of the entire $15 million fortune into a newly established, deeply protected trust registered exclusively in the name of Toby. I sat with the financial advisors for hours, drafting ironclad stipulations to ensure the money would be safely managed and completely inaccessible to anyone outside of my direct personal authorization. The wealth that Preston had so desperately murdered his sister to steal was now legally, permanently locked away in the very hands of the child he had tortured in a freezing basement. It was the ultimate, inescapable, poetic justice. I wanted to make sure that Toby would never have to worry about his financial security for the rest of his natural life. I wanted him to have the resources to attend any university he chose, to travel the world, and to build a beautiful, peaceful life far away from the dark shadows of his early childhood. The paperwork was incredibly dense, requiring dozens of signatures and notarized seals, but my hand never trembled once. Every stroke of my pen solidified the impenetrable fortress I was building around my brave grandson. The financial security was monumental, but it was not the most important legal document I needed to sign that month. The money could protect him from the harsh realities of the world, but it could not give him the deep, unconditional emotional foundation he so desperately needed to truly heal. For that, we needed to make our bond absolute in the eyes of the law. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, Toby and I walked together into the heavily polished halls of the state family court. We bypassed the criminal courtrooms, entirely stepping into a quiet, warm chamber filled with soft morning light. The judge presiding over our case was a kind, soft-spoken woman who had reviewed the harrowing details of our tragic story. She looked down at Toby from her high wooden bench, offering him a gentle, reassuring smile that made the boy stand a little taller. I sat beside him at the petitioner table, a thick stack of finalized legal documents resting in front of me. I had spent the last 2 months working closely with Director Evelyn Torres from Child Protective Services to expedite this exact moment. I picked up the heavy black pen the bailiff handed to me. I looked down at the final page of the official state decree. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the dark ink against the crisp white paper and signed my full name with absolute, unwavering conviction. The judge struck her wooden gavel lightly against the sounding block, the soft noise echoing peacefully through the quiet room. With that final binding signature, the dark, terrifying chapter of the basement was officially closed forever. I handed the pen back to the bailiff and looked down at the boy sitting beside me. I officially signed the thick stack of state adoption papers, completely cementing our permanent bond together and joyfully becoming his proud, devoted legal father, ensuring no one could ever harm him again. The heavy oak doors of the family courthouse closed behind us, sealing away the long months of grueling legal battles and marking the true beginning of our lives together. The ink on the adoption papers was finally dry, but the reality of bringing Toby into a healthy, normal environment was far more complicated than signing a state decree. I brought him home to my quiet, sprawling house in the peaceful suburbs of Chicago. It was a beautiful property, filled with warm, natural light, soft carpets, and large windows that overlooked a vibrant green garden. I spent weeks preparing a special bedroom for him, painting the walls a calming shade of pale blue, and filling the shelves with colorful books and soft toys. I wanted to give him the absolute best environment possible, a safe haven where he could finally learn what it meant to be a carefree child. But the deep, agonizing wounds inflicted by Preston and Valerie could not be erased simply by providing a comfortable bed and a warm meal. The trauma he endured in that freezing basement was permanently etched into his fragile nervous system. The first few weeks were a nightmare of heartbreaking setbacks. Toby was completely overwhelmed by the size and brightness of my home. He spent the first 4 days hiding inside the dark closet in his bedroom, pressing his back firmly against the wall with his knees pulled tightly to his chest. Every time I walked into the room, he would violently flinch, squeezing his eyes shut as if he expected me to strike him. I had to sit on the floor on the opposite side of the room, speaking to him in the softest voice I could muster, just to convince him to take a single sip of water. The nights were worse. Toby suffered from profound night terrors that would jolt him awake. I would hear him screaming, a sound of pure panic, and I would rush down the hallway to find him thrashing in his bed, fighting off invisible monsters. I spent countless hours sitting beside his mattress, softly rubbing his back and humming the waltz from his rusty music box until his rapid breathing slowed and he drifted back into an exhausted sleep. His relationship with food was the most difficult challenge we faced. Despite having unrestricted access to a fully stocked kitchen, the terrifying survival instincts he developed in that dungeon dominated his behavior. I would prepare large, nourishing meals for us to share, but Toby would only eat a few frantic bites before quietly slipping pieces of bread into his pockets. I started finding small piles of hoarded food hidden all over the house. He shoved crackers behind the sofa cushions, buried cheese inside his toy chest, and hid granola bars underneath his mattress. He was absolutely terrified that the endless supply of food would suddenly vanish, leaving him to starve in the darkness once again. It broke my heart every time I uncovered a secret stash. I never scolded him or threw the food away in front of him. Instead, I calmly led him to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator doors wide, and promised him that the food would never disappear. I told him he would never go to bed hungry for the rest of his life. I quickly realized that my love alone was not enough to repair the extensive psychological damage my son had inflicted. We needed professional help. I reached out to Dr. Aris, who connected me with a brilliant child psychologist who specialized in severe early childhood trauma. We began attending intensive therapy sessions 3 times a week. The therapist explained that Toby needed absolute, unwavering routine to rebuild his shattered sense of security. She told me to be incredibly patient, to never force physical contact, and to let him dictate the pace of our growing relationship. The therapy was incredibly hard work. There were days when Toby completely shut down, reverting back to a silent, trembling shell. There were afternoons when a loud noise from the street or a sudden shadow in the hallway would trigger a massive panic attack, setting our progress back by weeks. During those difficult, exhausting moments, I often found myself reflecting on the burning fury that had consumed me. I had spent so much time meticulously planning the absolute destruction of Preston and Valerie. I had focused all my energy on orchestrating their downfall, ensuring they spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting inside a federal prison. Bringing them to justice had felt incredibly satisfying at the time. It quenched my thirst for revenge and balanced the cosmic scales for the murder of my beautiful daughter. But as I sat on the floor watching my traumatized grandson weep because he dropped a glass of water, a profound realization washed over me. Vengeance, no matter how perfectly executed, possessed absolutely no power to heal. Punishing the monsters who broke this child did not magically put his fragile pieces back together. Legal retribution could not soothe a night terror, nor could it convince a starving boy that he was safe. I understood then that the real battle was not the one I fought in the courtroom. The true victory would be found right here in this quiet house, fighting patiently against the lingering shadows of his past. Only love and patience could fix what they broke. I committed myself entirely to the slow, grueling process of healing. I stopped rushing him. I established a strict, predictable daily routine that gave Toby a profound sense of control over his environment. I woke him up at the exact same time every morning, prepared his meals on a reliable schedule, and read him stories in a soft, steady voice every night. I celebrated every microscopic victory. The first time he walked into the kitchen on his own to ask for a glass of water, I felt a massive surge of triumph. The day I noticed he had stopped hoarding food under his mattress, I had to walk outside to the garden to hide my tears of sheer relief. Slowly, deliberately, the invisible walls around his heart began to crumble. The dark defensive bruises faded from his pale skin, replaced by a healthy, vibrant color. His hollow cheeks filled out, and he began to grow taller, his body finally responding to the continuous nourishment and care. The most beautiful transformation was in his eyes. The haunted look slowly gave way to a cautious curiosity. He started exploring the house, trailing behind me as I watered the tall green plants in the garden. He began to communicate, initially relying on gestures, eventually progressing to soft, single-word verbal responses. But the ultimate breakthrough happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon. We were sitting quietly together in the warm living room, building a complex wooden puzzle. He successfully placed the final wooden puzzle block directly into the board. He sat back slowly, and for the very first time, a genuine smile broke across his face. He looked up at me, took a deep breath, and spoke his very first full sentence to me, softly calling me by the name Grandpa for the very first time. The winter snow began to fall softly outside the large bay windows of my quiet suburban home. It was a peaceful, silent evening, a stark contrast to the violent, relentless rainstorms that had characterized the darkest chapters of our recent past. I sat alone at the heavy wooden workbench located in the corner of my warm, brightly lit study. Spread out across the smooth surface were several delicate, specialized metalworking tools, a small bottle of high-grade rust remover, and a clean, microfiber polishing cloth. Resting in the very center of the table was the tarnished, battered music box I had recovered from the freezing concrete floor of the basement. For the past 3 hours, I had been working with a slow, meticulous, and incredibly patient focus. I used a tiny pair of silver tweezers to carefully realign the fragile bent brass gears hidden deep inside the intricate mechanical heart of the device. I applied tiny drops of synthetic oil to the stiff, unyielding springs, coaxing the frozen metal back into fluid, effortless motion. I took the soft cloth and scrubbed the oxidized grime from the beautiful exterior shell, slowly revealing the elegant, sweeping floral patterns that had been buried under years of neglect and thick dirt. The engraved initials of my daughter slowly emerged from the shadows, shining brightly under the warm glow of my desk lamp. A G, Abigail Gallagher. The sight of those 3 simple letters no longer sent a crushing, suffocating wave of agonizing grief crashing through my tired chest. The profound, paralyzing sorrow that had dominated my entire existence for the last 7 years had finally begun to recede, washed away by the relentless, demanding, and incredibly beautiful work of raising my young grandson. I wiped the last remaining speck of dust from the gleaming silver latch. I took a deep, steadying breath and gently turned the small, winding key located on the back of the box. I felt the internal spring tighten with a satisfying rhythmic tension. I carefully released the delicate latch. The heavy lid popped open smoothly, and the complex mechanical cylinder began to spin with absolute perfection. A crisp, clear, and breathtakingly beautiful waltz instantly filled the quiet study. The haunting melody was no longer warped or distorted by rust and decay. It sounded exactly the way it had sounded 2 decades ago when I first handed it to my 10-year-old daughter. I closed the lid, pausing the delicate music, and securely tucked the polished silver box into the pocket of my thick wool sweater. I stood up from my wooden workbench, turning off the bright desk lamp, and walked slowly down the long, carpeted hallway of my sprawling home. The environment here was completely different from the sterile, terrifying emptiness of the massive suburban fortress my son had owned. The walls here were decorated with vibrant, colorful paintings that Toby had created during his specialized art therapy sessions. The soft, ambient light from the hallway sconces cast a warm, protective glow over the thick carpet. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped just outside the bedroom door of my grandson. The heavy wooden door was pushed wide open, a permanent and unspoken guarantee that he would never be locked away in the dark ever again. I stepped quietly into the bedroom. Toby was sitting comfortably in the exact center of his large, soft mattress, wearing a pair of warm, clean cotton pajamas. He was holding a brightly illustrated picture book in his lap, his dark hair falling softly across his forehead as he studied the colorful pages. The haunted animalistic terror that used to dominate his wide brown eyes had completely vanished, replaced by a quiet, cautious, and incredibly resilient peace. He looked up as I entered the room, offering me a small, gentle smile that instantly warmed the deepest, coldest corners of my heart. I walked over to the edge of the mattress and sat down slowly, making sure to keep my physical movements predictable and completely non-threatening. He set his picture book aside and shifted slightly closer to me, leaning his small shoulder comfortably against my arm. "I have something very special for you tonight, Toby," I whispered softly, keeping my voice incredibly calm and steady in the quiet room. I reached into the pocket of my thick wool sweater and pulled out the polished silver music box. I held it out, resting it gently on the flat palm of my hand, so the warm light from his bedside lamp illuminated the beautiful, sweeping floral engravings. Toby gasped softly, his eyes widening in absolute wonder. He recognized the heavy metal box immediately, but the primal, suffocating fear he used to associate with the object was completely gone. He reached his small healing hands forward and traced his fingertips reverently over the gleaming silver surface. He looked up at me, his expression filled with a silent, profound curiosity. "I wanted to tell you a story about this beautiful box." I continued, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure emotional gratitude. "A long time ago, before you were even born, I bought this exact silver box for a very brave, very beautiful young girl named Abigail. She was my daughter, Toby. She was your mother." I watched his wide brown eyes process the heavy, incredibly important words. I gently turned the small metal box over, pointing directly to the 3 engraved letters shining brightly on the bottom. "She loved this beautiful song more than anything else in the entire world," I explained softly. "When she left my house a long time ago, she took this music box with her because it reminded her of how much I loved her. And when she brought you into this world, she kept this box close to her because she wanted to share that exact same love with you. She wanted you to know that you came from a family that cherished you deeply." I reached forward and carefully unhooked the delicate silver latch. The heavy lid popped open, and the crisp, beautiful notes of the European waltz immediately floated into the warm air of the quiet bedroom. The complex tinkling melody wrapped around us like a thick, protective blanket. It was no longer a tragic, rusted symbol of a terrifying basement dungeon, or a haunting reminder of a horrific, unforgivable murder. The beautiful, flawless music had been completely transformed into a vibrant, living bridge It was a pure, undeniable connection linking my brave grandson directly to the beautiful, enduring memory of his loving mother. I watched the tension completely melt away from his small, fragile shoulders. He closed his eyes, swaying very slightly to the rhythmic, soothing beat of the mechanical waltz. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He simply leaned his head against my chest, absorbing the profound, unconditional love radiating through the quiet bedroom. We sat there together for a very long time, listening to the beautiful silver cylinder spin until the internal spring finally unwound and the final delicate musical note faded peacefully into the silence. Toby let out a long, heavy, and completely contented sigh. He shifted his weight, sliding down under the thick, warm blankets of his comfortable bed. I gently pulled the heavy duvet over his small shoulders, tucking the edges securely around him to keep the winter chill completely at bay. I placed the polished silver music box carefully onto his wooden nightstand right next to his glowing bedside lamp. I stood up slowly from the edge of the mattress and walked quietly backward toward the open bedroom door. I paused in the wooden frame, leaning my tired shoulder against the sturdy doorpost. I watched my brave, incredibly resilient grandson close his eyes and drift effortlessly into a deep, completely undisturbed sleep. There were no sudden, terrified gasps. There were no violent, thrashing night terrors. He simply slept with the absolute, undeniable peace of a child who finally knew he was completely safe from the monsters of the world. The heavy, suffocating darkness that had haunted my entire existence for 7 agonizing years was finally permanently lifted. I stood in the quiet hallway, a profound, unbreakable sense of ultimate clarity washing over my tired soul. I knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that my long, difficult life was finally meant for something truly pure. The seasons turned, washing away the frost of that first winter and ushering in the healing warmth of a new spring. Exactly 1 year has passed since that terrifying night when the dark walls of my world completely shattered, revealing the horrifying truth hidden in the freezing basement. Today, the heavy rainstorms are nothing but a distant memory. I am kneeling in the soft earth of my spacious backyard, the midday sun beating down comfortably on my shoulders. The air is thick with the sweet scent of blooming jasmine and freshly turned soil. Right beside me, digging energetically into the flower bed with a small yellow plastic trowel, is my 7-year-old grandson. Toby is wearing faded denim overalls and a bright green shirt, his hands and knees covered in brown mud. He wipes sweat from his forehead, leaving a comical streak of dirt across his rosy cheek. He is laughing out loud, a bright musical sound that echoes freely across the open garden. I watch him carefully place a young red rose bush into the freshly dug hole, his small hands packing the nutrient-rich soil around the delicate roots with a tender gentleness. "You are doing a perfect job, Toby," I say, softly handing him the small green watering can. He smiles up at me, his wide brown eyes shining with an unshakable trust that still takes my breath away. He no longer hoards pieces of bread in his pockets, and the paralyzing night terrors have completely vanished from our home. I is simply a boy, now, thriving in the warm, unconditionally loving environment his beautiful mother always wanted for him. As I watch him water the new roses, my mind inevitably drifts back to the agonizing journey that brought us to this peaceful garden. I think about the absolute monster I raised under my own roof. Preston and his cruel wife, Valerie, are sitting in separate maximum security federal penitentiaries, staring at cold concrete walls. They will never breathe the fresh air of a free spring morning ever again. They will never possess the power to hurt another living soul. Their life sentences were upheld without a possibility of parole. Their fake world was completely liquidated, and the massive $15 million trust fund is safely secured for the future of my grandson. I severed every single tie connecting my family legacy to the son who betrayed my blood. He is nothing but a ghost to me now, a dark, cautionary tale of unchecked greed. The monster is permanently locked away in a cage entirely erased from our vibrant new reality. But the angel, my brave daughter left behind, is thriving right here in the sunlight. I gently brush the dirt from the shoulder of Toby. He leans into my touch, completely comfortable and secure in his own skin. We decided to plant these specific red roses today because I told him they were the favorite flower of his mother. I told him stories about how Abigail used to run through this exact same garden when she was just a little girl, chasing butterflies and picking the brightest blooms to put in glass vases on the kitchen table. I want Toby to grow up surrounded by the living memories of the woman who sacrificed everything to bring him into this world. I want him to know that he is the living continuation of her brave spirit. He is the ultimate victory against the darkness that tried to consume our family. Toby finishes watering the last rose bush and sits back on the grassy lawn, admiring our hard work. Grandpa, do you think Mom can see the new flowers from heaven? He asks, his voice soft and filled with an innocent curiosity. I look up at the vast expanse of the clear blue sky, a profound sense of absolute peace settling deep inside my chest. I know she can see them, Toby, I reply with absolute certainty. And I know she is incredibly proud of the strong, kind boy you are becoming every single day. He smiles broadly, wrapping his small, muddy arms tightly around my neck in a sudden hug. I hold him close, breathing in the scent of fresh earth and clean cotton, thanking whatever higher power exists for giving me the strength to follow my instincts when everything seemed lost. I gently pull back and stand up, my knees popping slightly, in a reminder of my advancing age. I look directly at you now, the person listening to my long, harrowing story. If you have stayed with me through the terrifying discoveries, the agonizing grief, and the cold pursuit of justice, I want to leave you with one final vital piece of truth. Evil does not always announce its arrival with a dramatic warning. Sometimes it sits right across from you at your own dining room table, smiling warmly while hiding unimaginable cruelty behind perfectly manicured hands. We want to believe the best about the people we love, especially our own family. But you must never allow that love to blind you to the reality of their actions. If your gut tells you that something is deeply wrong, if you see a subtle flash of fear in the eyes of a child, or if you uncover a small lie, you must follow that thread. Do not ignore the quiet alarms ringing inside your soul just to maintain a comfortable artificial peace. The truth, no matter how profoundly devastating it might be, is the only weapon you have against the shadows. I spent 7 years wandering blindly through a thick fog of manipulated grief, unaware that my own flesh and blood was holding the answers captive in a freezing basement. It took a single rusted music box to shatter the illusion and set me on the path to redemption. But redemption is never found in vengeance alone. Watching the heavy steel doors of a prison cell slam shut on the people who murdered my daughter brought me justice, but it did not bring me healing. True healing is a deliberate, daily choice. It is found in the quiet moments of patience, in the slow rebuilding of shattered trust, and in the relentless love you pour into the innocent lives that depend on you. I chose to take the immense pain of my past and transform it into a protective fortress for my grandson. My name is Thomas Gallagher. I am a retired property developer, a grieving but healing father, and the proudest grandfather in the world. My story began in absolute tragedy, but it ends here in the warm sunlight of a beautiful garden, surrounded by the vibrant colors of new life. We survived the darkest storm, and we emerged stronger, wiser, and infinitely more grateful for the quiet blessings of a normal, safe existence. Thank you for listening to my journey. I hope it gives you the courage to seek the truth in your own life, to protect the vulnerable, and to never stop fighting for the people who truly matter. May your days be filled with light, and may you always find the strength to plant new roses after the harshest winters have passed.